mate, Luke Ford here. I just read a terrific book today by psychologist and university professor Mitch Prinstein titled Popular: Finding Happiness and Success in a World That Cares Too Much About the Wrong Kinds of Relationships. Let me play a video here. Mitch Prinstein talking about his new book, Power of Likability in a Status-Obsessed World.
Well, I'm here to talk about popularity, and I'm going to ask you to think a little bit about popularity today, how it's changed a little bit over time, and also to think a little bit about not only your kids' popularity, but perhaps your own popularity. And, you know, I used to start this talk by asking people to raise their hands to a variety of different questions and get a little bit of a poll as to the popularity of the folks in the room back when you were in high school. And, you know, I've come to think over time that I don't think that's entirely fair. You know, you don't get to know anything about me, and it's not fair to ask you to do something that I wouldn't do myself. So I think that I would like to share with you a photo and quiz you on whether you can, how much you already know about adolescent popularity. Here it is. Now, just in case you don't know the answer, let me give you a couple of clues here. I was 17 years old when I took this picture, despite looking about 11. People asked me if I was Doogie Howser for a number of years, and not. This picture was taken in 1987 when it was already really uncool to have those glasses. I was 4 feet 9 inches tall at this point, and just, you know, the perfect topping for all of that is that I, at high school graduation, won an award for having perfect attendance from the beginning of kindergarten all the way into the last day of my senior year. So, so obviously I was the coolest kid in school. You know, I want to talk a little bit about popularity because so many of us think about, even just hearing the word popular, that, you know, this is an experience that really characterizes our lives in high school. And to some extent, we kind of forget a little bit not only how much popularity plays a role before high school, but we like to pretend that popularity might not be a thing anymore once we've left high school. In fact, some of us have spent a lot of time and energy trying to sweep all those memories under the rug and really think about our popularity as being, you know, really not a part of our adult lives whatsoever anymore. I'd like to suggest that that's not true. And we might not call our social interactions popularity anymore, but whether we're thinking about our friends, our relationships, the people that we really look up to and regard, that we try to emulate, it really has a lot more to do with popularity than we might think. And one of the reasons why is based on some really brand new research that asks us to take a look back, but not just a look back at our own high school years, really a look back way earlier than that. I'd like for a moment just to journey back about 60,000 years. Because research is really suggesting in so many ways that we didn't even know before that fundamentally we are a social species. We are a species that was built to care about popularity. And the extent to which coming here tonight you thought about your high school experiences, or you have emotions just hearing the word popular, and the extent to which we always feel a desire to want to be liked, want to be well regarded, want people to think highly of us, that's not just a coincidence. There's something very deep in our evolutionary roots that is perhaps the reason why popularity continues to be so important. So it turns out that, of course, 60,000 years ago, there were not just humans that we are today on the planet, but about 4 or 5 different species. And the reason why we survived against all odds, no one would have bet on us. We were smaller, we were weaker, we were less resilient against hardships and bad weather or food deprivation. No one would have thought that we would have survived. The reason why we survived is because we learned how to become part of a herd. And our ability to be part of a herd and work together was absolutely the reason why we are here, sitting here today. Very much the fiber of our being, of our entire species' survival, is based on actually a small genetic mutation that allowed our larynx a slightly different shape. And with that shape, while all the other species had primitive-sounding grunts, we could go, and slightly use different sounds. That same genetic mutation also changed the development of a part of our brain that allowed us to understand the difference between one type of grunt and the other. And with the basis to communicate with one another, we became a social species. We were able to protect one another. We were able to work together, to hunt, to comfort one another when needed, to tell each other where we had hid weapons or how we can work together to accomplish big tasks. But we were a social species that was nomadic. So it was very important for us to kind of work together and all do things at the same time. This is why we're so inclined to really copy others, whether we realize that we're doing it or not. You know, some theorists have suggested that it's this kind of herding instinct and this desire to be part of the group that's led to signals that we can still identify today. Have you ever noticed that yawns are contagious? Have you ever heard the research that suggests that women's menstrual cycles might synchronize? All of these are based on the idea that there's some reason why we all needed to sleep at the same time, have sex at the same time, and give birth at the same time. It certainly isn't practical if we're a nomadic species to stop every time someone takes a nap. You sleep, we all sleep, we're all gonna go at the same time. In my head, all the prehistoric people talked like my Jewish grandma. Well, it turns out that there's now research that's telling us that the moment today that we feel socially excluded, there's a part of our brain that lights up. And it sends us a very, very strong signal. The surprise is that the part of the brain that lights up is the same part of the brain that's activated when we experience physical pain.
Yes, you can call it social pain. So it's much easier to endure pain if you have friends. Pain is much more painful if you don't have friends. There's a talk by Mitch, How Social Media Favors Negative Popularity. Important talk. Social media.
We have now entered a society where it seems like status is starting to rule. It wasn't that way all the time. It used to be that we were a culture that valued likability. We really fostered and taught our kids to care about connection, making actual relationships with one another. But actually, in the process of working on this book, I was with my daughter. My kids are 7 and 5 now, but they were a couple of years younger when I was working on this particular section of the book. And my daughter was obsessed with Frozen because, that's what 4 and 5-year-old girls are obsessed with. So while I was in the supermarket looking for a Frozen magazine, I found one, and it was right next to this issue of Tiger Beat magazine, which I was not a reader of when I was a teenager. So I was particularly curious to take a look at it, particularly because it had this particular headline, which it turns out was not unique to this issue or this publication at all. How you can be social media famous. And in the magazine, there was article after article explaining to adolescents that each individual person profiled used to be sad, insecure, wishing that they had more friends. But now, with 2 million followers, they were happy and successful, and all of the ails of adolescence were gone. And each person was profiled with a photo, usually a selfie, and a list of the number of their followers, communicating not implicitly, but quite explicitly, that their value as a contributor to society could be measured in retweets and in Instagram likes. There was a very clear set of instructions telling kids that this was not merely a hobby, but it was actually a career. They should hire publicists. They should talk with others about how to increase their profile, and to do so, they should tag and comment as disingenuously as possible to make sure that others would simply follow them, regardless of whether they believed in them or in the quality of what they said. This petrifies me, because we know that those who are high in status are likely to experience difficulties. But most of the world is giving kids a message right now that says, this is what you should be going for. And it's not just this magazine. I was surprised to find that adult magazines are doing the same. Photography magazines talked about the best ways to capture a selfie. CoverGirl has now issued a line of makeup that's designed to help you look best in selfie photos specifically. Our world has become one where social media has really become a way of us quantifying popularity like we've never seen before. And to be clear, it's not that social media is necessarily a problem. Social media does a lot of amazing things. It gives lonely kids an opportunity to get support and companionship from folks when they don't have that in their offline worlds. It's a place where we can get instant social support and aid when we're feeling down about something. It's actually also quite good at developing self-presentation skills. There are a lot of good things about social media. It's important that we recognize that these platforms were not designed specifically for those purposes in mind. They are, in fact, quite addictive as ways to get you to seek likes. And let me tell you, from our research lab, we have looked year after year at how many of kids' peer experiences are occurring voice-to-voice or face-to-face, and how many of them are electronically mediated. Those numbers have been changing with every year. At our last assessment, kids are telling us that 70% of their interactions with their peers are happening electronically. There are rarely offline peer interactions anymore. We're missing 70% of their peer experiences when we're not talking with them about this. Here's why this scares me even more. There's now been research to look at what happens in adolescents' brains while they are on social media by literally having kids go in an fMRI while looking at Instagram. What they found was, as I mentioned before, there are 2 different parts of the brain, one part that really lights up to give us a sense of pleasure and reward, and that part draws us in, tells us to do more of those kinds of activities. But there's another part, it develops a little bit later in adolescence. It's the prefrontal cortex. And that part of the brain is the brakes. It inhibits all of our urges and tells us, do not follow through with whatever you're thinking about. Stop immediately. But what they found was that when they showed kids images in the scanner, as you might hope, when Kids looked at something cute and adorable and nice. They found that the part of the brain that lights up is the part that is the approach center, saying you can engage in more of this, be interested in this, find this to be something positive that you approve of. When you show kids pictures of something dangerous, illegal, immoral, life-threatening, what you found is that there was instead a lighting up of that inhibition center, the front of the brain, saying, do not do this. You should be against this. This is really good news. This is an example of everything that we've taught kids working beautifully. But then they showed kids these same pictures in counterbalanced order, and they attached to it metrics that indicated that on social media, these photos had been liked very much or retweeted. As soon as they did that, the inhibition center of the brain shut off. Once kids saw dangerous, immoral, illegal, risky acts coupled with indicators that they were popular on social media, it changed their values. It undid everything that we've tried to teach them. It told them that if everyone else likes this, maybe you don't have to inhibit. What they found was that kids' values changed. These are the same processes that were used within our election cycle, but they're now being used to exploit our adolescents and change their value system based on what seems to be popular and what seems not. And the scary part of this is that most of this is occurring at regions in the brain that are beyond our conscious awareness. So this is happening all the time. We have no idea that it's even happening to us. A few things that I'll end with about what you can do. Think about the ways that we might accidentally be reinforcing status over likability. Is it the case that we get very excited when we hear that our child was invited to the most number of parties, or they got asked to the prom by the most number of people? When we hear that others are all trying to emulate and copy our child? That's okay. It's okay to feel proud of those moments once in a while. But when we say that out loud, or when we actually encourage our children to try and get more of those outcomes, we're sending a very clear message that they should care about status, that that's the kind of popularity that will make them approved in your eyes, and that that's something that you think as an adult is an important kind of popularity that people should have growing up as well. Unfortunately, that might be part of the ways that we can help. Because if we instead ask our children every day when they came home, tell me about something you did today that made someone else feel included. Tell me about how you made other people feel good today. Tell me how you helped kids who might have been experiencing difficulties. Then we are teaching them how to engage in the behaviors, and we're rewarding those instincts that will make them more likable. And likable will lead to a much better life.
Yeah, that's really good stuff. And I'm doing a show on this because likability does not come naturally to me. My brain naturally works in ways that make me unlikable. For example, my brain naturally pays very close attention to how many viewers I have. My brain naturally wants to outcompete other people who are live streaming at the same time. My brain naturally pays attention to how many social media likes I'm getting and comments and retweets I'm getting. All things that don't lead to happiness. My brain naturally focuses on how much status can I accumulate. Again, not something that leads to happiness or to likability. So as we age, I think we invariably become more agreeable and less neurotic, and so that makes us more likable. A couple of other things that have helped in my journey is developing an accurate sense of my own relative importance in my various interactions. So when I get into an Uber or I get into a Lyft, I know that I'm being ranked, the driver's being ranked. I'm not going to start ordering people around. If I want to suggest a driving direction, I say something like, you may want to go left here, right there, etc. But try not to give the Uber driver directions unless they ask for it. So that's helped. Also, diminishing my need to demonstrate contempt prior to investigation, and to watch out for other people. Watch out for other people who I bring on the show who start talking about books that they haven't read and ideas that they haven't investigated. Try to distance myself from people who consistently demonstrate contempt prior to investigation. Become wary of people who don't have an accurate understanding of their own relative importance in various interactions. I'm struck by reading this book by psychologist Mitch Prinstein, Popular: Finding Happiness and Success in a World That Cares Too Much About the Wrong Kinds of Relationships. So I'm struck by how much we can start positive or negative cycles. So start the day at work with a cheery good morning. How are you? How was your weekend? That's going to get your day off to a much better start than just a grunt. Taking a few seconds to say hello to people, inquire about their kids, or just showing a smile, sharing a joke. These kind of personal interactions, whether it's with the doorman or your Uber driver or the bus driver or other people on your suite or your neighbors or people at synagogue, like these positive interactions start to spiral just as negative interactions start to spiral. That's why I've become so much more attuned to antisocial behavior in the chat, so much quicker to boot people from the chat or to not bring people onto the show. They exhibit antisocial behavior. If people are just completely incapable of honest reflection on their own role in their own troubles, then I really want to minimize their presence on this show, because again, that starts bad cycles. So psychologist Mitch Prinstein, popular power of likability in a status-obsessed world.
It's not the part of the brain that makes us feel a burning or a throbbing sensation. It's the part of the brain that comes with it, that tells you that whatever you're doing, stop, do the opposite. You're in grave danger. And this makes sense. If you stayed in the herd, it meant survival. If you were kicked out of the herd, it meant imminent death. So our brains tell us the moment that we experience exclusion, people disagree with us, or tell us that they're generally not feeling as close to us anymore. And when the brain does that, it sends a signal downstream, and it actually changes our DNA. We are built with far more DNA than we actually need. We have a lot installed on the hard drive that hasn't been double-clicked.
So this guy is a real professor. He isn't just someone who's writing popular books and doesn't know anything. So I just heard about him today, but I like his book, recommend it. Looking at Twitter right now, Jacob Siegel says, Biden is like voting for hospice. Drudge Report says 2 who attended APAC conference in DC tested positive for the coronavirus. So from what I've read online, there have only been 7,200 tests for coronavirus in the United States, very different from South Korea, which has performed tens of thousands of tests. So one country's high IQ, homogeneous, has its act together. One country I'm a little more skeptical about, South by Southwest, has been canceled this year. Texas. So 2 New Yorkers who attended APAC in DC test positive coronavirus. That means coronavirus is all over DC. APAC is a huge event. These people have gone to bars, restaurants, Capitol Hill, maybe even the White House. As we all know, I have no expertise on coronavirus. In fact, I'm not really an expert on it
yet and activated. It's just there waiting for a reason to be kind of expressed. The field of epigenetics has just recently demonstrated that the minute that we experience social rejection, dormant DNA in our bodies turns on. The DNA that turns on is actually to activate a pro-inflammation response to protect us from imminent bacterial infection and help us to survive. Our bodies are so attuned to our popularity that to the very blueprint of our being, our experiences minute to minute, day to day of social rejection versus inclusion literally changes the entire construction of our body in every.
So for me, what's predicted my relative happiness level has primarily been how well am I getting along with other people? What are the qualities of my relationships? So I've noticed that when I'm getting along with other people, when I have friends, that my need to act out, that my need to bizarrely thrust myself forward to grab attention is considerably reduced. But as a somewhat isolated kid who grew up in foster care, who had very much the aura of a Holocaust survivor, when I was a kid, that deep-rooted depression, inability to get along with others, it exhibited itself in highly aggressive, mainly verbal behavior when I was a kid. I remember the first time I entered school was 2nd grade, and on my first report card, the teacher, Mrs. Thompson, said, Luke is always very willing to share his opinion with the class, but he needs to be more sensitive to the slower thinker. So I was not a particularly sensitive kid. I was a verbally aggressive kid, which obviously did not make me popular, but it's my lack of popularity that propelled my verbal aggression. If I was getting along with other people, I'd have much less need to act out and be aggressive. I remember my family moved to the Napa Valley from Australia in 1977. So there was 3 months of the American summer. And during that time, I met some of my future classmates at the Pacific Union College swimming pool. And when I met them, how did I react? I immediately just started splashing them with water. And they, of course, just naturally hated me. So when you're unpopular, you're much more likely to be aggressive, which is a very different thing than assertive. Assertive is simply standing up for what is appropriate. Aggressive is impinging, means harming others. When you gratuitously offend people, you're harming them. And aggression strongly corresponds with being unliked, unpopular.
Every single cell. We do this in my lab. We're able to look at adolescents before and after they experience a mock social stressor, and within 40 minutes you can see different DNA activated in their bodies. So I would say that popularity is something that we actually do care about deeply, far more deeply and substantially than we ever realized before. And that's important, because once we accept that fundamental premise, we can understand why it is that popularity may play such a remarkable role, not just for children and adolescents, but for decades and decades later. So I first began doing my work on popularity as a graduate student, of course, but in my first job at Yale University, I had the opportunity to teach a class. And at Yale, they let you teach whatever class you want, and I decided to teach a class on popularity. The reason why I was so interested in doing so is because the research literature has shown us that there are actually two very different kinds of popularity. Most of us are searching for the wrong one. So I wanted to do this class at Yale and talk a little bit about the two different...
Now, that's a great point. We're hardwired in our brains to seek social approval and status, but the pursuit of status, if it gets out of hand, like the pursuit of any of our natural instincts, such as for sex and for power and for money, will really do a number on your life. It will really mess you up. So what's much more effective than aiming for status and being obsessed about status is aiming for likability.
Different kinds of popularity. Well, at Yale, they don't have a course pre-registration system, so whoever signs up, whoever wants to show up on the first day of class, they automatically get in the class. So they assigned my class to a small room for about 35 students, and it was in a building right in the center of campus. And I walked up to the building about 10, 15 minutes early to get myself set up, and there were hordes of students that were standing outside the building, snaked from the room that I was assigned, little did I know, down the hallway, down the stairs, out the door, and surrounding the entire building like a mob. I had no idea what was going on. I assumed there was a fire drill, so I kind of just hung out there for a little while and started talking with the people, and finally just asked them, like, yeah, I wonder when this drill is going to be over. We need to get in. Like, I'm teaching a class. And they said, no, there's no fire drill. We just can't physically get into the building. We're all here for this class on popularity that this professor is teaching. It's like, oh my God, I'm that professor. I got to go. And kind of went running up there. And, it was Yale. So a lot of the students that were there were the children of senators and governors. And there were a couple of movie stars in there. And the next thing you knew, this had started to get a little bit of media attention. That 1 out of every 10 students on Yale's campus had registered and ultimately was in this class on popularity. And when the media contacted me, they wanted to do a news magazine, asked me if I would do a show about popularity with them. And what they asked me to do was to focus specifically on these two different kinds. The reason why they were so interested in this was because people like me, who are really interested in understanding how to predict which children will thrive and which children will suffer difficulties for the rest of their lives, had found something very startling. A lot of research had been done to try and identify all the factors that you might think of that predict success. Those factors included pretty much everything that our society focuses on as being important. They looked at IQ as an important predictor. They looked at gender, race, and ethnicity. They looked at family income as a predictor of student success, years of students' education. They looked at histories of mental illness, not only for children themselves, but also mental illness that ran in their family tree. They looked at the risk factor of physical illness on how well kids were able to thrive. They also looked at kids' substance use and their acting out behavior. What they found was that after controlling for all of these factors, there was one factor that played a role above and beyond everything. And ultimately, it was kids' popularity. When they looked at folks 20, 30, 40 years later, it didn't matter so much what their IQ was, what their mental health histories were. The kids that did the best as adults were popular, and the kids who did not were not. So the news magazine asked me, can you replicate an experiment that's been done to talk about the power of popularity? So I said, sure, let's give it a try. Let's talk about popularity at age 3. So they set me up in a daycare center about an hour outside of Manhattan.
So I wonder if there's any correlation between IQ and popularity, because a key function of likability is empathy. And IQ measures your capacity for empathy. IQ measures your capacity for abstract thought, and putting yourself in other people's shoes requires abstract thought. So just off the top of my head, I'm expecting that there would be some sort of positive correlation between IQ, empathy, popularity, and likability.
And they asked me to go in and to see if I could measure the popularity of 3-year-olds. And what they were interested in seeing was a classic study, see if I can replicate it. Would there be a way, when kids are popular or not, is that really just based on which class they're in? Does it matter what school they're in? Maybe if you take a kid who's really popular and you move them to a different class or a different school, they get a fresh start. They can be popular or not popular all over again. Now, the research suggested that that might not be the case. So they asked me to replicate this. What we did was we were able to measure the popularity of each and every 3-year-old simply by talking with all of the kids in the school one at a time. Now, popularity at age 3 is not based on how many Instagram followers they have. And it's not based on whether they have kind of like a tricked out big wheel that they ride around the sandbox or anything. Popularity at age 3 is the same as one of the kinds of popularity that carries on all the way into adulthood and becomes especially relevant all over again in elderly retirement homes. It's popularity that's based on likability. So we asked every kid there, tell me who are the kids that you like the most. Tell me who are the kids that you like the least. And of course they couldn't read, so they simply looked at a picture. And they gave us that information. Which were the kids that were the most accepted? Which were the kids that were the most rejected? And everyone in between. We were able to make an ordering of exactly how popular each kid was based on their likability. Then we scrambled all the kids. And because they were 3, they didn't have any history with one another. This was the first year for daycare in that facility. So the kids who were accepted were suddenly hanging out with other kids they had never met before. The kids who were rejected were hanging out with a brand new batch of peers. And they asked us to come in week after week and to see whether these kids would again emerge as being popular, liked, or whether the new kids gave them a fresh start. Well, we played with those kids for a little while, and we were in fact able to replicate the research. It took under 3 hours. The kids who were the most likable became the most likable all over again with these brand new kids they had never met before. And the kids who were disliked immediately became disliked in a span of less than an afternoon. Of course, we and other researchers have been really interested in figuring out what makes somebody so likable so quickly. And what's fascinating for me is that the answer at 3 is the same as the answer at 23, 53, and 103. The people who are most likable are the ones who are not aggressive. They are the ones that listen. They don't speak up right away. They're good at waiting their turn, seeing what the social norms are, and entering and changing the group from within. They don't dominate. They make everyone feel valued. They make everyone feel welcome. They make everyone feel cared for.
Okay, so these are the same sort of traits that will work for you at age 13, 23, 33, 43, 83. So not trying to dominate a group, working within a group, working from within, and paying attention to other people and having an accurate sense of your own importance. Now, the age of social media, internet age, what a lot of people are obsessed with is fame. And so what happens to get fame? And from the studies, there seem to be certain predictable stages. So stage 1 is elation. The attainment of high status is accompanied by a whirlwind of attention and adoration. Everything around you changes. You can feel it filter it down to your inner circle of friends. The attention comes with perks. Access is unbelievable. Suddenly you're worth something. Suddenly you feel important. Experience is often described as a guilty pleasure, a high, and a rush. Stage 2, feeling overwhelmed. Most people find their sudden rise in popularity becomes too much to deal with. Fame 101 is needed to teach people what's coming, the swell of people, the requests, the letters, the emails, the greetings on the streets, the people in the cars, the honking of the horns, the screaming of your name. A world comes to you that you have no idea is there. It just comes out of nowhere. It starts to build and build like a small tornado, and it's coming right at you. It's huge and sweep you off your feet and take you away. And this leads to stage 3, resentment. The attention becomes irritating. You're an animal in a cage. You're sitting at a sporting event. All of a sudden, You have someone asking for an autograph, wanting to talk to you, wanting your attention. Step 4, addiction. The ambivalence regarding popularity becomes too much to bear. If you've ever watched True Hollywood Story, you'll recognize this stage as the moral of each episode. Being addicted to almost every substance known to man at one point, and the most addicting of all of them is fame, says one celebrity. People become dependent on their next hit of fame, hating themselves for wanting it, but desperate to have it anyway. Some high-status individuals never get beyond this phase. Their life becomes an endless chase for an ever greater high. So particularly see this with those who release, say, celebrity sex tapes. If it eludes them, they become the junkies who will do almost anything to get one last taste of notoriety. So desperately crave. The cycle can become debilitating because, unlike other addictions, it inherently requires the participation of others to satisfy the craving for high status. And stage 5 is splitting. High status individual realizes his popularity is not based on his actual character at all. Find out there are millions of people who like you for what you do. They could care less who you are. It's not really me. It's this working part of me, the celebrity part of me. I am a toy in a shop window. People report they are forced to form split personas to retain any real sense of a genuine self-concept, a version of themselves that is for the public, a version that they can maintain with friends and family. True self remains trapped in between. Over time, it becomes harder and harder for them to even remember which part of themselves is real. One reported, I had 2 different dialogues, the one I'm thinking and the one I'm saying. Can't be as authentic as I'd like to be to show my true self. Stage 6, loneliness and depression. This stage, no one really knows the high status individual at all. You've lost all your friends. Just by all the adoration that comes from stardom, they feel inferior. You're regarded as extraordinary, they are regarded as ordinary. They really not have anything to do with. Stage 7, wishing for something else. Celebrities have everything that many other people wish for, but lack the one thing they desire most. Popularity is an intrinsically untrustworthy dance partner. It can leave you at any time. In response, these high-status individuals decide to invest in something that feels authentic. For many people, it's politics, for others it's humanitarian work, it's charity, stumping for a cause. They're looking for genuine human connection. They're looking for relationships with people who care about them for who they are, accept them, and want to spend time with them. So while the rest of the world is wishing for status, those who have it are wishing for likability, which is the type of popularity that is so much easier to achieve than status.
This is what it takes to be an extremely likable person at home, at work, at school, and especially in a retirement home. So this is probably why when you look at those kids who are the most likable, we find that in adolescence, those who are the most likable are much happier than those who are not well-liked. It predicts years later the quality of friendships and romantic relationships in adolescence. Being very likable predicts school retention and grades quite strongly. It also predicts thriving in giving back to the community service, volunteering, doing things that really help enrich the world around them. Likability is a strong predictor of this in adolescence. Some research has followed folks out beyond adolescence. In fact, research has now looked at folks 20, 30, 40 years after they've left school. The results have been remarkable. Those who are most likable are more likely to get hired decades later. They're more likely to get promoted. They make more money. They also have better quality relationships. They have much higher marital satisfaction. They're more likely to stay together with their partner. And their children end up being more likable as well.
So I think a lot of this is genetic, that people genetically prone to various spectrums in the Big 5 personality test. So agreeableness, this in large part is agreeableness and being low in neuroticism. So the Big 5 are what? Agreeableness, neuroticism, conscientiousness, outgoing versus introverted, and one other factor. So I think most of this that he's talking about is genetic, though I'm sure there are behavioral choices and things you can do to even change your thinking that can make a difference.
In some cases, but often more well-adjusted. They're less likely to suffer difficulties, and that next generation does better in their grades and in their
So when you look at people who stay together, they're high in agreeableness and low in neuroticism. You look at people who can't sustain relationships like me, talking about characters who are low in agreeableness and high in neuroticism. So people who go from marriage to marriage to marriage, talking about, generally speaking, people low in agreeableness, way too high in neuroticism to be able to sustain relationships.
Their happiness and in their confidence. And for reasons that I just mentioned, people who are more likable actually live longer. They have less diseases, and they have a longer lifespan because of that DNA effect that I mentioned before. Some research has looked at the effect of being popular, or I should say, excuse me, being unpopular on mortality rates. They've compared the mortality rate of being unpopular on your likelihood of death. They've looked at whether it was just as strong as the effect of obesity, if it was just as strong as the effect of lack of physical exercise. Being unpopular beat them all. The only risk factor that is equal in strength on your life expectancy as unpopularity is the risks that come from heavy smoking. There's something about our popularity, at least our likability, that seems to be remarkably important over the decades. So a lot of people ask me, how is that possible? How does that work? How could the way that you interact with kids in your grade or kids in your school, how might that have this lifelong effect? And the answer is the remarkable cascade effects that come from being likable. Just to really briefly show you that, what we find is that those who are the most likable are invited to be a part of more activities. At the childhood level, we see that these are folks who are more likely to get invited to birthday parties and playdates and to be asked to volunteer for other kinds of clubs. Well, if you think about that...
So this is all a painful topic for me, and so if I'm going to talk about something painful, then much more likely that it's real and authentic. So in second grade, my first year in school, Gavin Brown was having a birthday party, and I was not invited. I think almost all the other boys in the class were invited, but me. And I was over hanging out with my best friend at the time, Wayne, and his mother intervened and forced the boys, talked to the parents and forced them to take me along. So I was really happy that I got to come along, and I was biking along with the other boys through the bush outside Avondale College, and the other boys made sure to let me know we didn't want you along, but we were forced to allow you to come along. And even today, I sometimes have flashbacks to that, where there's a conversation that I want to get into, and I'm not invited into the conversation, but I just kind of hang around the periphery of the conversation and try to participate when I can. And then I participate, and it's just like dead air. And it's just so obvious that people don't want me in their conversation. And it's just a horrible feeling. I go like right back to second grade, where the other kids let me know that we never wanted you along at this birthday party. We're just being forced. Now I force myself on other people to try to join their conversation, but it's a very sick feeling. It happens to me much less often than it used to because I'm more attuned to not participating in that kind of behavior. But it's hard when there's a great conversation going on near you that you want to be a part of, but you also know that you're not welcome into it. So the honorable and dignified thing is to not to try to interpose yourself into that conversation. So as I get older, the more attuned I get, the less I try to stick myself into conversations where I'm not wanted, because it's an awfully sick feeling when you do it and it's just brought home to you. No, you didn't misjudge this situation. You're just genuinely not invited to this conversation.
The 3-year-old or the 13-year-old who gets those opportunities, every one of those experiences gives them the chance to learn a specific skill. When you go to a playdate, you're learning more how to share, how to resolve conflicts, how to interact with a great deal of emotion that comes up while you're playing in a rambunctious way. With each of those opportunities, it leads to a skill. This also happens for adults. Every member in a company who is well-liked, that gets invited to be on more teams, that gets invited to talk with people after work, they learn more about the corporate politics. They learn more about the things that play a role in that workplace environment. And with every of those opportunities, they gain more skills. Well, those skills lead them to become more likable. That child who knows how to share and emotionally regulate and interact with their peers is all the more likable as a result. And this begins to snowball over years and years and years. This is why these kids do so well. The kids who are not very well liked, they are not only not getting the opportunity to go to the average number of playdates or birthday parties, they're actually deprived, and they're getting less opportunities. So when everyone else has learned what to do if you get two conflicting birthday parties, or how to handle a situation when two people want you to play at once, these kids, unfortunately, have never gotten that opportunity. So when the time comes for them to use that skill, they don't have it. That makes them only more disliked, and their spiral is unfortunately much sadder.
Absolutely correct. That's so true. The more disliked and unwanted I felt, the more aggressive I behaved, verbally aggressive, and then that just increased the dislike for me. So one guy who I thought was one of my best friends in high school, I got in contact with him about 5 years later or 10 years later. And he said, this is a guy I thought was one of my best friends. I was over at his home a lot. And he said, my memories of Luke Ford in high school are not fond. You're an arrogant turd who was always, completely sure that he was right, even when he didn't have a clue what he was talking about. This is a guy I thought was one of my best friends. I mean, how completely out of touch was I? Like, ouch. And he still wants absolutely nothing to do with me to this day. Like, I've reached out to him like every few years on Facebook, and he doesn't respond. So to this day, he wants nothing to do with me. Like other friends from high school that I reached out to, two brothers that I was quite friendly with, very, very friendly with, and reached out to them about 10 years ago and left email, phone messages, nothing, zip, zero, zero. So they wanted nothing to do with me. And part, I think, it was the shifting of religion. So when I converted to Orthodox Judaism, it was an implicit message to those with whom I shared a Seventh-day Adventist upbringing that I regarded them as wrong. So that's just the implicit message. It's disturbing to people that when their old friend goes off and converts to a strange religion. So I think that's part of the story. Still painful.
I was really interested in just exactly how that might work. So what I did was, in my class over the years, I've designed an experiment that we do. I want to see whether we can understand that cascading effect that might happen in a single day. Could we change people's experiences with popularity? And could we fundamentally change the way that they interact with people just with one tiny manipulation? So what we did was we asked everyone in the class to design a t-shirt. We wanted it to be a loud, ridiculous, tongue-in-cheek t-shirt. So we picked a color that hurts your eyes if you look at it with the sun reflecting off of it. We picked a saying that the kids picked that they thought would get them a lot of attention on campus, and people would find it funny and tongue-in-cheek. In this last time that we did it, we used this particular one, which DJ Khaled kind of references him. But in other years, we've picked other kinds of t-shirts that I'm the most awesome, I'm so popular, which everyone realizes is a big joke. Now, UNC Chapel Hill, in particular, has 14,000 students. And when a few hundred people are all wearing the same very, very bright t-shirt, we can guarantee that they are going to be treated differently for a day. And that's what we wanted to see. What happens if for a single day, you are getting a different kind of attention? Well, we all know that if the environment treats you in a certain way, it's going to affect you. It's going to affect your mood. It's going to affect how you feel about yourself. Someone cuts.
So I often had the pleasure in my childhood of being adopted, so to speak, by functioning families or functioning individuals, like friends who were popular, and they adopted me into their circle, and my life just like dramatically improved, or families that kind of adopted me into their family, and my life just dramatically improved. And as my life improved, my desire to act out and be aggressive and nasty, that desire diminished. My desire to show off and to attention seek dramatically dropped. I just started feeling okay inside, thinking, well, the happiest memories of my childhood were away from my parents. One particularly happy stretch in my childhood were the last 6 months of 8th grade, because my parents moved to Washington, D.C., and I just started to feel like a normal kid, and I just finally started really connecting with my classmates in a way that I hadn't during the previous 2.5 years. And so there were those times of feeling whole, and they came there with a price. They were borrowed functioning, because as soon as my best friend in 9th grade, he died in a horrible tractor accident just few days after the end of ninth grade, or just life, people would move on. Or I had one good friend and we got into an argument. I wanted to aggressively cover the football team and whether it was getting a favorable treatment, particularly favorable treatment from teachers at Placer High School, and he was an athlete in another sport and he didn't want to do anything to rock the boat of his high school, and so he didn't talk to me for a year. So then that borrowed functioning that I was relying on, it would just be pulled away, and I'd be plowed back to my old state. Only now my old familiar state was all the more painful because I remember what it was like to live as a functioning human being with friends and relatively smooth social interactions, and have homes that I could feel a part of, and families and friendship circles that I could feel a part of. So then I would much more keenly feel the loss.
Once you off in traffic, you might not be feeling very good about things.
I remember when I'd come home, for example, I spent the summer between 10th and 11th, and between 11th and 12th grade, I spent the summer with friends at Pacific Union College. These were wonderful, wonderful times. I was made a part of the family, a functioning, loving family. To me, when I'd meet kids who love their parents, even to this day, it's a whole strange world. It's like, what's that like to love your parents? And I don't hate my parents by any means, but I just don't know what it's like to love my parents. And so when I'd be adopted into these functioning families, then I'd go home. My home would just feel so cold. By comparison, it's like the coldness was in the walls, was in every cabinet, was in the windows, was in the floorboards, was in the carpet. It's like you can feel the warmth and the love in a functioning home, and then in a home that's not functioning, dominant memory of my own home is just so cold, from the kitchen sink to the wooden cabinets to the carpets and the floorboards to the doors and the ceilings. It was just like, whoa, just painfully cold.
Or about the world, as you pull into your parking spot. That's not what we are interested in looking at. What we are interested in looking at is how, when the environment changes you, how does that elicit new behaviors and feelings back out of you to change the environment reciprocally? So what we did is we asked these kids to keep track of exactly what they thought, what they felt, what experiences they had, what social kinds of interactions occurred on a regular day when they wore just their regular ordinary t-shirts. And then all of us, myself included, wore the very loud, obnoxious, tongue-in-cheek t-shirt on campus and got lots of attention. People come running up to us, ask us, what's that for? Oh, that's kind of funny. And they get a lot of attention. And sure enough, when students in my class are asked to write about it, they say, yes, more people came and talked to me. People were nice to me. People joked with me. In other words, people treated them as if they were pretty likable. The thing that was surprising is how much kids said, I can't believe how much just that little bit of a change in how the environment treated me changed me. The kids who spent all day walking across campus staring down at their phones looked up, waved, said hello to people, met strangers. The people who were in classes and never raised their hand would raise their hand. They felt smarter. They felt more competent. They felt bolder. Kids told me that they ended up asking out people they had crushes on for weeks. They made friendships. They exchanged more social media information with one another, and those relationships lasted for weeks and months after the experiment.
So we have a tremendous potential to positively affect other people. I know the empathy that I've developed from my own struggles with loneliness, that when I see someone in a room at a social occasion and the person is alone, I usually make an effort to go speak to them. So in Orthodox Judaism, if there's like a black guy or in a room, usually in Orthodox Judaism, he's going to be the only one. And I will be probably more likely than anyone to go over and to begin a conversation. Someone who's in a wheelchair, someone who's got some kind of deformity, or someone who's just socially awkward because of my own pain that I've suffered from loneliness and social rejection. I feel empathy for those who are alone in a room filled with social people having a good time. And I know that can have start a positive cycle for people. It calms down their central nervous system. They are less likely to be aggressive, and therefore, coming from a calm place, they're more likely to get into a positive cycle. So we have the potential to transform other people's lives just by some small acts of kindness.
They told me that simply being treated so nicely for a day brought out a side of them that they had never seen before. When that happened, the environment met them where they were. As they were more bold and happy, people treated them more happily and with more energy and enthusiasm, and it spiraled for them in just the course of one day. One of the kids said, if I wore that t-shirt, metaphorically, every day from my childhood, I would be a completely different human being today. And you know something? He's right. That's what the research is telling us. Unfortunately, everything changes once kids reach adolescence. And that's because of something that seems to occur inside adolescents' brains. So you might know, of course, that when adolescents mature, they mature one kind of piece at a time. And one of the things that happens way before you hear any voices crack or you see any acne or anyone starts feeling awkward is something that's occurring in the brain. The adolescent brain is maturing in a way that makes them able to engage in adult-like thought. It's the brain.
So if you saw the Meryl Streep movie A Cry in the Dark, one of the early scenes is some trucker. He's a group of Adventists and says something about, you know, these effing Adventists. So I grew up part of a distinctive in-group, very much separate from wider society. Now, a lot of the people, even most of the people in my in-group were much more socially attuned and more likable than I was. So I'm responding to Frank's question in the chat. Did being an Adventist make you feel like you're an out-group? So, well, when I was an Adventist, all my friends were Adventists. So my whole life was pretty much lived within the in-group. But yes, we felt very separate from and cut off from wider society. I felt so cut off in my Seventh-day Adventist upbringing that I've always struggled understanding what a cousin was or what an aunt was or a niece or an uncle, because I had so little interactions with my wider family. Because being strict Seventh-day Adventist, it made it quite difficult. It cut you off from the wider family that weren't Seventh-day Adventists. And so I missed those relationships. On the other hand, I had a very distinct sense of who I was. I had a very distinct sense of my own identity, and I was part of a strongly identifying, close-knit in-group. And I can't imagine any other way that I would like to go through life other than being part of a strongly identifying, closely knit
that we all live with for the rest of our lives. But that adolescent brain actually.
So converting to Orthodox Judaism was the most like my Seventh-day Adventist upbringing of all the different strands of Judaism, because it's high-intensity religion. So the Seventh-day Adventism that I grew up with was high-intensity religion. Orthodox Judaism, again, high-intensity religion. People have a lot of commitment to each other, helping each other, sacrificing for each other, and working together.
Actually changes one brain region at a time.
So it wasn't the pristine beauty of Orthodox Jewish theology that led me into Orthodoxy. It was the experience of living in Orthodoxy, and that there's the tight bonds that would be developed as you go to synagogue every day, pray together, study together, have Shabbat meals together. And in Orthodox Judaism, everybody pretty much walks to shul, so they have to live much closer to each other. So again, there's more human interaction. There are much tighter bonds than when people are driving 5, 10, 15, 20 miles to go to temple.
And the brain region that changes almost first is a region that gives us a big rush of rewards. And the rewards that we get are the same kinds of rewards, they're from dopamine receptors, that we would get when we experience the pleasure that might come from, let's say, recreational drug use. So yes, these rewards are addictive, hard to resist, and they're powerful. Well, it turns out that in an effort to try and make sure that all adolescents will one day move out of their parents' houses and not come back and live in the attic forever, our brains are designed to make us get a lot of rewards when we spend time with peers, and to biologically be programmed to think that our parents became totally lame as soon as we hit 12 years old. That's how our brains are organized. Well, the things that give us rewards when we're hanging out with our peers are the same exact things that give rewards to other mammalian species. In fact, this is a part of the brain that we share with most other mammals, and it's below the part of the brain that we think of as being uniquely human. If you're interested, it's called the ventral striatum. And what it does at the moment of puberty is it makes us want to seek that experience of being highly visible, of seeming powerful, of seeming alpha, of having people want to copy us and follow us. And yes, just like other species, we may be tempted to act aggressively just to get that kind of attention and power. That's what popularity is about in adolescence. That kind of popularity is not at all based on likability. In fact, it's based on status. And for most kids who are high in status, they happen to also be low in likability. Aggressive behavior will make you very disliked, but aggressive behavior is actually quite successful in making you higher in status. So suddenly we see a very brand new type of popularity emerge. And when you talk with adolescents, they'll say to you, I don't know why you're defining popularity as being who we like. That has nothing to do with who's cool and who's popular and who gets the most attention in high school. That is a completely different thing. So it's true. Research has now looked specifically at those who are rated as being higher or lower in status, and the correspondence with likability is actually quite small. So what happens to those who are high in status? Do they enjoy all of the benefits that we saw with all of the kids who were really likable? Well, if anyone's been to their high school reunion, they probably know of the myths, the adage that they peaked too soon. They didn't do as well. They were the kids who ended up staying in the same place where they grew up with the same friends, and they really never made very much out of themselves. Is that true? Is it really the case that high status leads to difficulties? Well, the answer is yes. Research has now been able to follow those who are high status well into adulthood. And what they find is that those who have the highest status are not likable. They tend to be more likely to be in transient romantic relationships.
So this is definitely true for me. I've never had a romantic relationship longer than a year. My mind, way I'm built, the way I'm wired, is that I naturally think about 20 times as much about status as I do about being likable. And that is not a way of approaching life that works. This guy, this university professor, is speaking truth.
They're anxious. They're depressed.
Yep.
They're much more likely to suffer from addictions.
Yep.
They don't hold on to jobs quite as long. They're less likely to get promoted and to have stable jobs.
Yep.
And they tend to have difficulties raising their children. The people that are high in status have been given feedback in childhood that tells them that aggression, bullying, being domineering, and seeking status will lead to short-term rewards. Because, frankly, much like other animal species, it does. Sadly, those who are aggressive and domineering do get more attention. They do, temporarily, get more power. And also, quite temporarily, they do have more influence. What happens in studies where people have looked at those folks who are high in status and saw what happened to them a little bit later on, is that they found that these folks have continued to believe that those same dynamics are what works all throughout their adulthood. When they're broken up with, they report.
So when I get feedback from people I went to high school with, they expected me to become successful, and most of them didn't particularly like me very much.
The reason why I was broken up with was I wasn't popular enough. I was not as high status as I need to be. If I was higher in status, I'd be able to keep somebody. The reason why they don't do well in their jobs is because they're never satisfied with going high enough. They have to have higher and higher and higher status. And they have to get constant reminders of that status. And let's face it, seeking status is a way of putting your happiness into someone else's hands. Saying the only way that I will feel good is if everyone else constantly tells me that I am high in status according to them. And it's about comparing yourself to others constantly. No one ever became happy by comparing themselves to others. This is cyclical. And when researchers would ask folks to bring in a romantic partner and a best friend, those kids who were formerly very high in status, and say to them, tell us how it's going in those relationships, the high status kids, now adults, would say, it's great. These are great relationships. But the partners would say, I'm not liking this relationship. This is one of my worst friendships. They're not close. They stay superficial. All they're concerned about is using me as a way of elevating their status. And that's what the romantic partners say as well. This is similar but slightly different than what we hear about when we talk with celebrities. One of the things that I did also in working on this book was to look at those who are high in status in this more global way. Not just those who are celebrities, but looking at CEOs, looking at...
And I'm looking at Twitter right now. Julia Landau tweets, I just landed at JFK after reporting on the coronavirus in Milan and Lombardy, the epicenter of Italy's outbreak for Vice News. I walked right through US Customs. They didn't ask me where in Italy I went, or if I came into contact with sick people. They didn't ask me anything. So when you go through airports in this country, you just get overwhelmingly the impression that the government hates you, and the people who are tasked with operating airports, they generally seem to be on the lower ends of the bell curve. They generally seem to be quite surly and unpleasant, as opposed to when you go to Australia and, from what I understand, Japan or other countries where you have more intelligent more likable, more efficient people operating things.
At politicians, sports heroes. And when you talk with them, what you find is that you get a remarkably similar story all the time. Even this level of high status is related to loneliness, depression, and a feeling that they desperately wish that they had others close to them. Long story short, the research generally seems to suggest with these types of high status people that there's a desire for people to interact with them, but they need to set up a wall, a way of interacting with people that maintains their status, their reputation. But the only way to do that is to close their real self off, and they split. They have their public persona and their private persona. And while more and more people love that public persona, fewer actually know that the person that they are inside. And it makes them feel quite alone and distanced from others. And they trust fewer and fewer people, so they don't let many others in. And this is the same thing we hear over and over in a large scale, like a celebrity, as well in a much smaller scale when talking with CEOs, who tend to suffer from depression at a far higher rate than is seen in the general population. Here's why this concerns me now, more than 20 years ago when I first started doing this kind of research. We have now entered a society where it seems like status is starting to rule. It wasn't that way all the time. It used to be that we were a culture that valued like.
And this is not universal around the world. It's not this way in Northeast Asia, but in our individualistic society that has become disrupted by high rates of immigration, so we're not nearly as cohesive and bonded. We don't have as much in common with our neighbors. Immigration policy over the last 50 years has operated on the idea that the less in common we have with our neighbors, the better off we are. Absolutely insane. So this has disrupted the social cohesion that this country used to enjoy. And just looking at Twitter right now, Peter Brimlow tweets, sale, 1 week only, Camp of the Saints by Genre Spy, signed by Peter Brimlow. Only $35 each. So you can get Genre Spy's novel Camp of the Saints, signed by Peter Brimlow.
Ability. We really fostered and taught our kids to care about connection, making actual relationships with one another. But actually, in the process of working on this book, I was with my daughter. My kids are 7 and 5 now, but they were a couple of years younger when I was working on this particular section of the book. And my daughter was obsessed with Frozen because, you know, that's what 4 and 5-year-old girls are obsessed with. So while I was in the supermarket looking for a Frozen magazine, I found one, and it was right next to this issue of Tiger Beat magazine. I was not a reader of when I was a teenager, so I was particularly curious to take a look at it, particularly because it had this particular.
Okay, I just played that. So I hit many of these themes about 12 years ago when I was interviewed for this documentary.
When you're involved in this industry, you lose your humanity. You're no longer treated as a human being by 80% of people out there. You know, now scum. Like, they may want to do certain things with you, but then you're still scum. And like, if they may be thrilled to have a roll in the sack with you, but when you leave, they're going to want to burn the sheets. You can take every other category, every other idea, every other thought. Basically, happiness and success in life all boils down to what are the quality of your bonds with other people. Having anything to do with the adult industry hacks away those bonds, so you're isolated, alienated, pushed away to the margins, and not treated as a human being. That's a recipe for disaster for me and for anyone else. Hookers are hookers. I mean, hookers are people who are looking for a quick buck with the least amount of effort, so they turn tricks. And being a porn star is just like the world's oldest profession. So it's not that complicated. Reality is hard. A lot of people blame the industry for their problems, but then they get out in the real world and find lots of problems in the real world too. I mean, people who are well-adjusted and have good life skills and who are doing something meaningful and constructive with their lives, they're not in the industry to begin with. So the people who are in the industry are really broken, twisted souls without a lot of great job skills, and they're turbulent souls. So they're always going to be twisting and turning in the wind. Is it possible to lead a normal life after you get out of it? This is forever. This is the scarlet letter. It never goes away. You'll be dealing with the implications of this forever. What tends to happen is that it isolates you, and so you develop a fear of being rejected again and again and again. And so you put up walls between you and other people, and you isolate yourself, and you don't join communities. And when you're isolated, you're less likely to suffer rejection, but you're also isolated and living on the edge. So you can never get away from this. There's no solution. Here are some people we talk to who are leading normal lives and are doing pretty good. Like, how the hell would you really know? Like, how would you know what really goes on in their life at 2 a.m., the torment, how would you know? They're going to tell you about all the times they've been rejected and isolated, and the horror and the shame that their children confront, and their spouses confront, and the shame that they've put their families through, and relationships that have been permanently broken. I mean, all the burned bridges behind them because they've done sex work. Most families aren't proud when their daughters become hookers.
Okay, let's go back here to...
You should be against this. This is really good news. This is an example of everything that we've taught kids working beautifully. But then they showed kids these same pictures in counterbalanced order, and they attached to it metrics that indicated that on social media, these photos had been liked very much or retweeted. As soon as they did that, the inhibition center of the brain shut off. It's happening all the time. We have no idea that it's even happening to us. I should mention that this is not just about teens. Adults use a lot of social media as well, and these things are also occurring in the same way. And many of us are susceptible to the same kinds of traps, the same ways that we are lured towards what seems popular, and we are pushed to kind of seek our own level of popularity, even on social media. I can tell you that I myself, even after having written this entire book, found how easy it is to get sucked in. And it was specifically while I was asked by the publicist for this book to say, who told me, you need to up your social media profile. So I want you to start tweeting a lot. Okay, that's odd. That's exactly what I don't think is the best idea. But I believe that there's a way to use social media responsibly, to make actual relationships, to recognize that there are human beings on the other ends of those mouse clicks. And if there's a way of actually learning about others and collaborating and caring about the people that you're interacting with, then social media can be great. So there I was, tweeting away. Sure enough, a famous celebrity followed me with millions of followers. And here I have in one ear my publicist telling me, you want to get a lot of followers, you want to make sure that people all know about your book that's about to come out. So there I was, just seeing that some celebrity followed me with millions of followers, and it happened to me too. I started thinking, I wonder what I could post that I know that person would approve of, and then maybe they would retweet that post. And then all the people that they retweeted that post to, then they would start to follow me. I thought, oh my God, I'm doing it. I'm getting sucked in just like everybody else. You start to get so addicted to the idea. In this case, it was quite instrumental, but I could feel that sensation of, wow, imagine that this many followers kind of started to follow me. And then everything that I said would be noticed by all these people. And I could start to inject my opinions into national debates, and people would retweet those. And it is addictive. It is hard. All of us have posted something on Facebook and had a lot of friends like it, and we know it gives you that momentary feeling of like, oh wow, lots of people clicked that one. They all saw me. They all approved of that. That makes me feel good. That's dangerous. We never had a mechanism that allowed us to access that 24/7 before. A few things that I'll end with about what you can do. First, I think it's really important to recognize that the person that you were back in adolescence as a parent is still affecting you today. The reason why is because that development of our adult brain that was occurring when we were adolescents used those formative experiences with popularity to serve as a filter or a template. It changed the way that we interacted with people from then on. And that filter or template is continuing to influence the way that you see every social interaction every minute of every day. I'm going to show you a little bit how that is. Here is a very brief video with 3 circles and a box. That's it. I've shown this video to thousands and thousands of people and collected the responses and asked them very simply, what happened in this video? Nobody tells me that it was a video about 3 circles and a box. Everyone immediately anthropomorphizes those circles. And the things that they see, the ways in which they take this very simple piece of social information, filter it through their own prior experiences, and retell what it is that they think they just saw, turns out is a bit revealing of their own high school popularity experiences. Some people have said, looks like they're having fun. This is a game. Some people have said, the other 2 are dissing Blue. What's going on? He got left out. Some say they're playing tag. Some say they're blinded by rage. One told me, Blue is a narcissistic lover. And another said, it looks like they're having a tickle fight. I see responses across the entire spectrum. People who see this as a very, very aggressive interaction, and people who see this as a very playful, fun interaction. Turns out that those people who had difficulties with popularity in high school, or any difficulties at all, will see it increasingly aggressive, more aggressive, extremely aggressive, depending on how much rejection they may have experienced. The people who do not experience a lot of rejection will see this as a much more positive or benign interaction. Well, it doesn't matter what you see on this video. You'll probably never see it again. But what does matter is that there's research that says that the ways that you interpret social interactions are changing the interactions you're having as a parent with your child and how you're coaching your child in their peer interactions. Moms and dads who see hostility in interactions are more likely to jump in and try and break up fights that are not necessarily even happening, and also things much more subtle than that. And similarly, moms that never and dads that never see any kind of aggression or have a blind spot to see when their child really is being rejected or at risk, and they don't know how to teach their child to ward off against that. So the first piece is to really just own our own experiences as adolescents and recognize that indeed those are still affecting the way that we see the world. The second thing that I would suggest is to think about the ways that we might accidentally be reinforcing status over likability. Is it the case that we get very excited when we hear that our child was invited to the most number of parties, or they got asked to the prom by the most number of people? When we hear that others are all trying to emulate...
Okay, we hit that already. So I do recommend this book titled Popular: Finding Happiness and Success in a World That Cares Too Much About the Wrong Kinds of Relationships. So it's by psychology professor Mitch Prinstein. The book came out in 2017. And it's one of the strongest predictors of soldiers functioning in the military was how popular they were in primary school. Childhood popularity predicted soldiers' behavior even after accounting for every other factor. A number of other studies in non-military populations yield similar results about the power of likability. More than childhood intellect, family background, prior psychological symptoms, and maternal relationships, popularity, aka likability, predicts how happy we grow up to be. Do we enjoy or dread leaving for work each morning? Are we in relationships that are fulfilling or conflicted? Do we regard parenting as a burden or a pleasure? Are we making contributions in our lives? Do we feel as if we are valued members of our community? The answers to these questions can all be traced back to the playgrounds of our youth. So they did this study and they divided kids into four. There were the kids who were accepted, kids who were rejected by other kids, the kids who were ignored, and the kids who were controversial. So I think I was the kid who was controversial. So the kids who were accepted, they grow up to have marriages that were happier, work relationships that were stronger, and they were flourishing members of society. People who remember unpopular childhoods report just the opposite. Popular, likable children grow up to have greater academic success, stronger relationships, make more money, while those who are not popular and not likable were at much greater risk for substance abuse, obesity, anxiety, depression, problems at work, criminal behavior, injury, illness, and even suicide. Yeah, because if you're not meeting your need to connect through your bonds with other people, then you'll have to connect with either a process like gambling or porn, or with a substance like alcohol or drugs. So we now understand that popularity changes the wiring of our brains in ways that affect our social perceptions, our emotions, and how our bodies respond to stress. It even alters our DNA. Now, one type of popularity is simply a reflection of status. Having high status in high school does not predict good things down the road. How often do we make decisions that we feel will help us gain this kind of status, gain power and influence, without realizing that we're inadvertently undermining our own true chances for happiness? So, someone who's blogged for 22 years, yes, I've done this. How much energy do we waste investing in image management because of our misperceptions about how best to achieve social approval? How much is our lingering desire to be popular affecting, warping our behavior without our even realizing it? Now, the guy who discovered that surgeons and doctors should wash their hands before dealing with patients was a guy, Philip Semmelweis. He was a Hungarian physician and scientist, and he proposed back in 1848 that doctors and nurses should wash their hands prior to working with patients. and he published a book of his findings on the topic, and he was absolutely right. But everybody hated him because he was an arrogant jerk. And so his findings were not accepted, not until Louis Pasteur confirmed germ theory. So everybody hated Dr. Semmelweis. He eventually suffered a nervous breakdown. He was treacherously committed to an asylum by his colleague, and he died a mere 14 days later at the age of 47 after being beaten by the guards. He died from a gangrenous wound on his right hand. It might have been caused by the beating. Dr. Semmelweis had high status, he had high influence, he was well respected, even revered and powerful, but he was a bully and thus loathed by many of his peers. So kids who were accepted as children, they usually have the ability to read the room, to understand their own relative importance in their interactions. They know when to offer their ideas. They recognize when there is emerging consensus or conflict. They are better than average at tuning into the emotional underpinnings of statements of those around them. They're adept at using their social skills to connect with other people. They're good at asking astute questions. People who ask a lot of questions when they first meet someone appropriately tuned in way is a highly effective way of scanning for an emotional connection. People are more likely to have high quality relationships later. Questions will clearly communicate that I want to know more about you, that I find what you have to say interesting, important, and relatable. And this type of social behavior signals that you care about the group. People want to talk to you because you want to talk to them. That makes you likable. Also having a sense of humor. This is a function of reading a room well, because a good joke requires understanding the current mood or sentiment and exaggerating or twisting it for comic effect. Then these kids are trustworthy, they are friends, they are fair, they are happy, polite, patient, they know how to share. They tend to be successful in life. So when accepted children become adults, they have higher average self-esteem, they make more money, have better quality relationships with friends and romantic partners, even grow out to be physically healthier than their less accepted peers. So the power of likability persists above and beyond the effects of all kinds of factors that we usually think are the most important, like intelligence, socioeconomic status, and healthy behavior. As for the neglected, they watch their peers play from afar. They remain behind a fence poking a worm with a stick rather than joining in with the others. That's my childhood. Or they attempt to take part in a game of hide and seek and no one comes to try to find them. Neglecteds tend to be anxious, desperately eager to be part of the group, but really confident enough to initiate interactions with others. As adults, neglecteds are slower to begin dating, to establish secure, committed relationships, and they usually choose professions that do not rely on heavy interactions with others. They are unlikely to become salespeople, recruiters, or public speakers, and much less likely to become successful. Okay, high school popularity, how does that affect us today? Is more from Rich.
Is there something about who you were as a teenager that's still affecting your life today? Probably, but most of us don't realize that this is the case. A study was done by a group of economists. They were interested in understanding why it is that some people make more money than others. They had a huge database, 20,000 men in the UK. They looked at all kinds of predictors of earning potential. But what they found was kind of surprising. It turns out that men's height is related to their salary. Taller men earn more money than shorter men. But it wasn't how tall these men were in their 30s that predicted their salary at that same age period. It was how tall they were at the age of 16 that mattered the most. The study tells us that there's something about who we were back then that is still affecting us today. It's still somehow playing a role deep inside us. Of course, when most of us think back to high school, we don't really think about our height. What most people think of when you ask them to talk about adolescence was popularity. Almost everybody, no matter how many years it's been since you've graduated high school, can remember the names of the most popular kids in their grade, and also where we stood on the social hierarchy. Psychologists have been interested in studying, is it also the case that our popularity in high school is still affecting us for the rest of our lives as well? Well, psychologists have found some surprising results, and that's because there are actually two very different types of popularity. One type of popularity is likability, and it's good for us. In fact, we're only now just learning how powerfully our likability can affect us. The second type of popularity is status, and status is bad for us. In fact, it can even be dangerous to us. And that's particularly important right now, because for the first time in the history of our species, we are starting to become confused about these two different kinds of popularity. Remember back in kindergarten, when you were running around on the playground? You might remember that there were some kids that everyone wanted to spend some time with, but there were other kids that might have been excluded, or playing by themselves, or rejected. This is a measure of likability. And even back then, at that early age, psychologists can reliably measure who is most well-liked. Now, unless we do anything to change the way that we get along with others, which we can, by the way, quite easily, then this form of popularity sticks with us for decades. Likability is based on how much we make others feel happy, valued, and included. And the way that this works in kindergarten is not altogether different from the way that it works in high school, the way that we get along in our office, the way that we meet new friends or romantic partners in our personal lives, or even how we do within our community circles. It's remarkably important that we think about the power of likability, because not only are those who are most likable more likely to be hired, promoted, make more money, and they report more happiness and fulfillment in their lives, but our likability also affects our likelihood of contracting diseases. A recent meta-analysis, or a synthesis of prior studies, revealed that those who lacked close and supportive relationships were twice as likely to die as those who had positive social experiences that typify likable people. Now, that's an incredibly powerful association. In fact, it's so powerful that psychologists have looked at what other health risks might predict our mortality as strongly as peer rejection. And the only factor that comes as close is smoking 20 or more cigarettes a day. So likability is very important. A lot of people wonder how it could be that how much others like us could play such a big role. Well, actually, the way in which we socially interact with others has a whole lot to do with why it is that our species survived and why it is that we're all sitting here today. 60,000 years ago, we were not the only human-like species on the planet. There were many intelligent hominid species who honestly should have made it. No one would have bet on us to survive. We were weaker, we were smaller, we were more fragile and less resilient. But there was one thing that we had, one advantage, and that was a small mutation that changed the shape of our larynx. And with that small change, we were able to develop language. Language made us into a social species. As a herd, we were able to work together, share with one another, share tools and cooperate and protect one another. Soon, the extent to which you were in the herd was associated with your survival. If you were kicked out or ostracized, you were at much greater likelihood of serious injury or death. Now, a lot of people today say that they don't care about whether they're popular or not, but science tells us that we deeply are concerned at a biological level about what other people think about us. In the moment after we are rejected by peers, fMRI research tells us that our brain sends its most powerful warning signal, motivating us to change our behavior and do whatever we can to get back into the herd. Our likability even affects the expression of our DNA. Research tells us that within 40 minutes of being dumped, fired, teased, or excluded, dormant DNA in all of our cells turns on to protect us from injury. That inflammation response that's turned on is of course not needed today. If we're unfriended on Facebook, we're unlikely today to be attacked by a woolly mammoth.
This just rings so true for me. I know that more vulnerable times in my life, when my life wasn't working, I would wake up at 2 a.m. and get up and turn on my computer to see if I'd been unfriended on Facebook by somebody. So during the day, I'd post all these offensive, triggering things, and then at night, I'd miss the connection and worry that I'd been unfriended. And then get up at 2 a.m. to see if I'd been unfriended. So I've spent most of my life in one mood, like in the upside of my bipolar cycle, saying things that are triggering and offensive. And then as I go into the downside of my bipolar cycle, then feeling incredibly vulnerable, worried, scared, frightened, and alone. So that's the way I've gone through most of my life. So in the upside of my bipolar cycle, I'd behave as if whatever I did and said had no consequences. And then in the downside of my bipolar cycle, I would think that no matter what I said or did, there was no hope. So either way, on either end of the cycle, I was approaching life with the idea that what I was saying and doing would have no consequences, that there was no way of changing my fate. It was not a way of going through life that worked.
However, our bodies are built based on what we experienced millennia ago. And that inflammation response in our DNA leaves us susceptible to more inflammation-related diseases, as well as depression. So likability is very important, but that's not the type of popularity that we learn about in high school. Changes in our brain around the pubertal transition instead make us very focused on status. Status is based on how much everybody knows who we are, how much we're prestigious and dominant and powerful and visible. Now, most adolescents who are very high in status are actually very disliked by their peers. But adolescents pursue this type of cool nevertheless, because the parts of their brain that are related to addictive pleasure and social bonding become supercharged at around the age of 11 or 12. So yes, our kids are biologically programmed to think that their parents have become like totally lame as soon as they hit puberty. And instead they pursue status.
So I know this show is much better with guests and people on the panel, so I send out about 15 invites every show. Other people have other priorities, but yeah, this show, like life itself, is built to be done with other people. I notice a big difference between walking a mile on my own. That can even be tiring, walking 2 miles on my own. On the other hand, if I walk 6 miles with somebody I like, it's just a pleasure. I just love it. And I'm invigorated by it. So things that are done with people you like are wonderful. And, just undergoing like minor bumps in the road, some small pain, some small forms of loss with no one you can share it with, that can be a real bummer. That can really bring you down. So I think there's an old saying that joy shared is twice the joy, and pain shared is half the pain.
Now, it used to be that we grew out of this desire for status as soon as we graduated high school. But in today's society, we are focused more on status than ever before. We've even developed digital platforms that allow us to mouse click for status 24/7. And that's a concern. Because when research has followed those really cool high-status kids from high school and seen how they're doing decades later, it's not a happy ending.
And the chat says, so is this guy saying that high school is more important than college? Well, I'm wondering out loud, do we think more about high school? I think I have more vivid memories of high school, events in high school, people in high school, interactions in high school than I do in college. But I do believe that, I think our primary memories come from about age 12 to about 22. Does that seem right to you?
Those kids who were the highest in status and those who are pursuing status are at much greater risk for relationship difficulties, anxiety, depression, addictions, and they're even less likely to keep their jobs. But in today's society, we have confused status and likability. We spend more time and energy thinking about how to make ourselves stand out within the herd, rather than how to create real, authentic, close communication and connections with others, or how to develop a sense of community. This is a big concern for all of us, but it might especially be a concern for today's teenagers who know of no other world than the one that we have given them. How popular were you back in high school? Were you someone that everyone liked? Were you someone that was desiring for more status? We have a basic human instinct that makes us interested in how other people think about us.
So I'm curious for people in the show, growing up in your first 18 years of life, press 1 if you're above average in status, press 2 if you're average in popularity mean popularity here, not status. So press 1 if you're above average in popularity growing up your first 18 years. Press 2 if you're average. Press 3 if you're below average. So my self-perception is that I was a little below average in popularity overall in my first 18 years of life. Painful thing to admit. I'd kind of look at other people and just kind of wondered how they just effortlessly got together and did things, invited each other to each other's homes. They seemed to do all sorts of cool things together, and I was just kind of envious, and I was often kind of reduced to hanging out with people who are equally unpopular, or hanging out with people who are like 2 or 3 years younger than me. And so yeah, that's my self-perception, just a little below average in popularity.
And every day we have an opportunity to make a choice. Science tells us that the best way to achieve happiness and success is not to make the choice to try and increase our standing above all others in our society, but to do what we can to make everyone feel welcome and included in our herd.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Let's get a little bit more here from Mitch Prinstein, how our childhood popularity affects us as adults.
Hi, we've been talking about the ways that we are still affected by popularity and why popularity is so important. And previously, we talked about the ways that it might really be built into how our brains are set up and even how our DNA responds and is expressed. But I want to move on by talking a little bit about how popularity is affecting each and every one of us, actually thousands of times a day. Specifically, we're going to talk about how your experiences with popularity when you were younger affect a lot of the ways that we think about our social experiences. But
yeah, I think he's absolutely right, because I notice I have many automatic reactions that do not serve me. While other people in an identical circumstance, they react with a smile and with openness, and my tendency is to react by kind of closing down and being grumpy. So one of the characteristics of the rejected, the neglected, the unwanted kid in school is that you grow up to have like an anxious attachment style. You obsess about the quality of your relationships, and there's nothing like obsessing over the quality of your relationships to really make it difficult for people to be around you. I'm thinking of one friend I had in particular who's just constantly needing reassurance, and those people are exhausting. It's just exhausting. The people who just constantly want reassurance. So I think since I've been a teenager, I've been keenly aware that many of my instinctive, unthought through, almost uncontrollable, unconscious and non-conscious reactions to stimuli do not serve me. And so I had this insight a few years ago while watching a movie that you notice that almost all characters in movies, TV shows, and novels, they would avoid the horrendous troubles that they get into if only they had something to live for that was higher than themselves. But because these characters are usually pursuing the satisfaction of their instincts, either sexual satisfaction, status satisfaction, monetary satisfaction, or whatever their instinct is leading to, because they put nothing above their own instincts, then they're just constantly getting into trouble. And the path of recovery is to learn to live for things higher than the satisfaction of your own instincts, because when you pursue your instincts out of proportion, then you just get into trouble. So like me, you go to bed with all sorts of women that you should not have gone to bed with. Some of them can turn out to be crazy, or you can work an insane number of hours to try to get more status, and then just work yourself into physical collapse, so that I then spent most of my 20s in bed. So my instincts got very out of whack. So I got into my 50s with $50,000 in credit card debt, no romantic relationships that lasted over a year, and my life was was a complete shambles and a failure. So research tells us being rejected is one of the most consistent risk factors for a whole range of psychological symptoms such as depression, anxiety, substance use, even criminal behavior. Yeah, I remember my therapist of 10 years told me that I should call my memoir The Uninvited because I just had all these keen memories of not being invited to my friends' birthday parties and the like. Not every rejected individual experiences mental illness, but many such rejected children do continue to feel shut out even as adults, at work, in communities, at church. They feel that the group is trying to avoid them or feels uncomfortable with them being around. And so then you get into a habit of opting out of dinner parties or social events. You may spend a lot more time online than is good for you. And you start shunning all sorts of social interactions because you're so afraid of being made to feel inferior again. Now, such rejects may find a spouse, usually another reject, and may eventually just develop a few close friends, but they walk around with this perpetual fear of being marginalized. And this is true for me. I'm not talking about people out there. I'm talking about me and my lived experience. There are all these photos of me at parties, and I just look so miserable that I just giving off this aura of despair. That's what used to strike people. That I was just vibrating an aura of despair. And then this leads you to seeking a vocation or workplace populated by others who similarly feel rejected and neglected. So I got into blogging. I could just do it from home, and I didn't have to worry so much about being rejected or neglected. I could just retreat to my home and learn to manipulate your contacts with other people so that you reduce the opportunity for rejection. But by so reducing your opportunity for rejection, you simultaneously reduce your opportunity for connection. And these old feelings of insecurity would just haunt me whenever I'd get outside of my comfort zone. Often when I'd meet a woman, if she was above a 7, I'd just feel too insecure to approach. I just would feel too unworthy. I'd only date women who were like a 4 to a 7. Because inside, I just innately felt unworthy, anxious, angry, rejected. These feelings can manifest themselves subtly through a continual need of reassurance from loved ones or a continual need for attention, a hypersensitivity to being teased or excluded, or fear when meeting people who then remind them of their childhood mentors. I remember this rabbi that I was tracking, and he said to me one day, "Luke, I just get the feeling from you somebody misused religious authority, and so as a result, you just hate everybody in religious authority." And he was right. I just developed this instinctive hatred for anyone who reminded me of my father. I remember in 7th grade, I was teasing all these other kids, but then they turned around and started teasing me, and I just blew up. I just like lost it and like walked out of the room, and the teacher reprimanded the kids, like, "Why'd you do that to Luke?" And they said, "He teases us all the time." So I was dishing it out, but I couldn't take it back. And it's common for rejects like me to develop a push-pull relationship with the world, judging others the way to feel superior, yet the whole time dependent on positive feedback to undergird my own fragile self-esteem. So it was exhausting going through life being me because I was continually trying to look at my relationship to others and trying to find some angle, some perspective whereby I was superior to others, but continually having this haunting sense that I was definitely inferior. So in my 20s, like it was easier to feel a part of my peer group, but by my 30s, people were pairing off, getting married, having kids. They were moving ahead in their professions. They were getting mortgages. They were taking esteemable positions in society. And where the heck was I? I was blogging. And then there's the controversial types, people like me as well, the class clowns, everyone's favorite peer when part of a large group, but not necessarily someone who people are eager to invite into their circle of close friends. Yeah, that was me. I was funny, I was sarcastic, I was cutting, and people often found me entertaining, but they did not want to be friends with me. These individuals can be adroit socially, but also quite aggressive, tend to be Machiavellian, strategically using their social skills when it serves them, but willing to knock others down to get what they want. Yep, that's me. We don't know a great deal about how controversials fare over time, but available evidence suggests that although they may achieve some short-term gains, they do not do well in the long term. That's true for me. So our likability essentially predicts our fate in many domains of life. Likable people have the advantages. Dislikable people, Carlson, always suffer.
Before we do that, I'd like for you to watch this video. Just watch the video, and you're going to be asked to say a little bit about what you saw in the video. So watch carefully.
And for those who are just listening, it's just showing 3 balls, one blue,
So what
one
we're going
green,
to talk about now has been studied by psychologists for many years, and it's referred to as social information processing. Nikki Crick and Ken Dodge were among the first to develop a model that's really a way of taking every single social experience you have and zooming it down into super slow-mo. So if you were to try and think about all of the tiny little unconscious processes that are happening between the moment that you see something and the moment that you respond, you would divide them up into a few different steps. So the first thing that happens is that there's an event. This could be a big event, like someone breaks up with you, or it could be a tiny little event, like you're walking through a crowd and someone nods at you. Very subtle. Turns out that in order for us to respond to that event, there are many little steps that happen. And the first one is whether or not we encode that event. So for instance, if you were walking through a crowd and someone nodded at you, you might not even notice it. You might be looking at somebody else, or you might be looking at your phone, answering emails, or you might be assuming that no one is interested in looking at you, so you don't really even attend to what happens. It's very common for professors to talk about teaching in their class, and rather than noticing all of the students that are looking at them and kind of nodding, they really tend to focus on just those students that are looking down and clearly are doing Facebook while they're lecturing. That's a really great example of cue encoding, the idea that they tend to even just notice some things more than others and actually don't even see the other things in their visual field at all. But once we see something, once we've encoded something, and we've said that our brain has brought it to some attention to us, then we have to interpret what it is that we've seen or heard or felt. And we call that cue interpretation. And there are many different ways that we might interpret what it is that we've just encoded. And we'll talk about that more in just a second. Well, after we've interpreted something, then again, really fast, unconsciously, we don't even realize that we're doing it. We then decide, what is our goal? What are we hoping to achieve in this particular situation? And that becomes an important step called goal clarification. Once we have a goal, we come up with a variety of possible things that we could do to respond. We select one of those responses, again, super fast, we're not even aware we're doing it. And then we follow through on that with response enactment. So in other words, we decide to act out what it is that we say, that we thought rather, that we wanted to do.
So this is a good model. It very much rings true to me. Findings reveal that only about 35% of those who are high in status are also highly likable. Many of the rest are simply controversial. We typically look down on people who openly crave high status. So I remember when I first moved to Los Angeles in 1994 and I was going to all these Jewish lectures, and every lecture I'd raise my hand to ask some complicated question. And after a few of these, a woman came up to me and said, "You're always attention seeking. You've always got to try to ask a question to try to make yourself look smart." Seeking this type of status, this type of popularity, is the kind of pursuit we associate with preteens and boy bands. Adults who act like this, we call them status seekers, wannabes, or fame mongers. Is it wrong to desire high status? It's certainly more socially advantageous to have this type of popularity than not. Imagine attending a party where everyone is excited to talk to you, amused by what you say, and impressed by how great you look. Yeah, I love walking into a room where there are people eager to talk to me, and I don't like walking into a room where nobody cares to talk to me. Consider how gratifying it would feel if at every work meeting your ideas were heralded as the most inspired and influential. Think about how special you would feel if people were excited just to meet you and talked favorably about you afterward. Who would not want to be venerated by their peers? Research shows that when we read about high status people, talk about them, or even just look at them, these actions are sufficient to activate the social reward centers in our brains. We tend to gaze at high status people much longer than we look at others around us. So I remember when Dennis Prager would walk into the room, like the air would change, like everyone would orient towards Dennis Prager. Without even realizing it, our brains habitually orient us toward status all day long. Yeah, so my brain habitually orients me towards status 20 times as much as it orients me towards likability, which is much more important for my happiness and my success. We experience social rewards when we believe that someone we admire likes us in return. Anyone who has ever fantasized about meeting a celebrity and then becoming best friends can relate. When we are tempted by social rewards, we are particularly likely to act impulsively. This explains why so many of us have done regrettable things when we're in the presence of high-status peers. When we're around famous people, we may gush or behave in an awkward, embarrassing fashion. Not only are we biologically primed to enjoy feeling that others agree with us, but those of us who have the most dramatic social reward response are especially likely to conform to the views of others, and this all takes place outside of our conscious awareness. In adolescence, our self-concept is not merely informed by how our peers treat us, but is fully dictated by such experiences. I remember just how difficult it was to, act outside of peer approval as a teen. Reflected appraisal continues into adulthood, for some though more than others. Many people's sense of identity seems to be overly influenced by the last bit of positive or negative feedback they receive. This was very true of me until the last 4 years. Hearing that someone likes them makes them feel like they're a good person, while exclusion makes them feel like total failures. Yeah, that's most of how I've lived my life. Some are so invested in having high status, it seems as if their entire identity is dependent on it. Yeah, that was the way I felt, and the way many of my girlfriends would feel. Like 100% of their self-esteem would come from their looks. When we crave social rewards, we don't feel casually about it, but view it as the basis of our self-worth. Do you still long for status in adulthood? Do you desire motivational magnets, things that you associate with high standing, such as beauty and wealth? How often is your behavior driven by a yearning for extrinsic reward outside of your inner self? To what degree do you allow your inner experience of happiness and self-worth to be sabotaged by your pursuit of status? So there are 4 basic problems with pursuing status and how it damages our likability. One is that we will tend to go way too far for status. So Jane Goodall studied chimpanzees, and she noted that status offered chimpanzees a survival advantage. The more they are attuned to status and driven toward the social rewards it offers, the better chance they have at meeting their basic needs. There's an anthropology professor, Dan Merton, who was observing a group of cheerleaders in an American high school. Cheerleaders ruled, others looked up to them. They had the first access to the most popular boys. They set the trends that other girls followed. When an unpopular girl joined the cheerleading squad, the other girls reflexively behaved aggressively toward her. They teased her, they ostracized her, they made sure her reputation was besmirched across the entire grade. So if you ever try to join a group much higher in status than you, this is what's going to happen if you don't belong there. The cheerleaders knew their treatment was mean. They even recognized it would earn them reputations as stuck-up snobs. It didn't matter. This aggression was to protect the exclusivity that defined their status. It was a necessary evil to maintain dominance. The cheerleaders explained that allowing a lower status girl to join their group would come at a decline in their own status. So each time a high status teen acted aggressively in school, whether towards someone in his group or even someone similarly high in status, it was to preserve the social hierarchy. Punch in the face or the start of a nasty rumor. It's an act of dominance, letting victims and onlookers alike know the boundaries that define status in that school. Threats to the social order are sanctioned by publicly forcing submissiveness. So this is reactive aggression, very different from hot-blooded aggression, impulsive aggression, or uncontrolled reactions to anger or frustration. Reactive aggression is proactive aggression. It's cold-blooded, it's calculating, it is targeted precisely toward those who threaten the perpetrator's dominance. So yeah, if you are on the receiving end of this kind of reactive aggression, realize that you got out of your lane. I remember I was taking political science class at Sierra Community College, and the professor, Larry White, was about the most popular professor at the college, and I just got out of my lane. I just started asking lengthy questions. I started trying to take over the class, and till one day he just blew up at me, cut me down, and then gave me a B in the class, even though I was doing A work. And we eventually became friends, and I got A's in other classes from him, and he eventually awarded me a Student of the Year award in political science at the college. I went off to UCLA and I wrote him a letter about how much I appreciated his teaching. And he wrote me back. He said, you know, you've got a good brain, you're very verbal, but you need to be careful about how you use it or people will hurt you. He was responding to how I had driven him to just cut me down in class. He exploded, said, just, you know, so sick of your haughty attitude. I'm so, you know, so tired of your pompous attitude. So sick of you trying to take over my class. You know, people will hurt you, because he gave me a B even though I'd done A work. So if you're on the receiving end of reactive aggression, realize that you have threatened the social hierarchy and learn your place, learn your own relative importance. Proactive aggression is goal-oriented. The goal is to obtain or defend status, and bullying is the best known expression of proactive aggression.
And once we respond, that often produces a new event. So for instance, if this all started by someone nodding at you, and you end up deciding to nod back, that might lead to them waving or saying hi or something like that. If you decide instead to do something rude to them, then that might lead to some sort of event where it would start a whole news cycle, and it happens again and again. Well, all of this happens based on all of our prior experiences. So every single experience that we've had socially is stored in a database. And there's actually good brain research to say that when we look at how people respond to things, it often is involving centers of our brain involved in autobiographical memory. So we are very frequently drawing upon these old experiences, particularly, as it turns out, experiences with popularity, as a way to understand how every social experience happens to us every single day today. Now, sometimes we think about these steps very, very explicitly. We'll talk about that in a second. But first, let's talk about an example where we might see this play out, and I'm going to show you 3 different pretend people and how they might respond to a similar event. So for instance, imagine that someone walks by, they look at you, they smile, and they giggle a little bit. Well, imagine that in the cue encoding step, the first person might look at that and say, I just saw a person laughing at me. Okay, so they, because of their database, they really attended to the laughing. The second person might say, I just saw a person make eye contact and smile. So they didn't really remember the laughing as much. Their studies show that if you ask them later, they might not even recall that that happened, or they might not even noticed it. But they're really noticing the eye contact and the smile. And the third person, maybe they're the kind of person that doesn't believe that anyone would ever smile at them. They have a lifetime of rejection or feeling that they're never noticed by anybody. They are, studies show, less likely to even notice when people do look at them. So they might not even notice anybody. Well, the next step that would happen then is cue interpretation. So that first person might say, I think that person was making fun of me. You know, I saw them kind of laughing. And my automatic thought, the thing that I immediately associate with that is, I think they were teasing me somehow. But maybe the second person, who kind of was really noticing the eye contact and the smile, might interpret that by saying, oh, I think maybe that person's flirting with me. And of course...
Okay, so this is psychology professor Mitch Prinstein, and I'm loving his book called Popular: Finding Happiness and Success in a World That Cares Too Much About the Wrong Kinds of Relationships. So popularity problem number 2, when we strive for status, have we granted some of our peers too much status? Several Years ago, TV star Jenny McCarthy began appearing on talk shows to discuss her new book, which she claimed that a vast medical conspiracy was covering up a link between vaccines and her son's autism. To be fair, a parent's coping strategies and search for meaning in the face of a child's devastating diagnosis is perfectly understandable. McCarthy never claimed to be a scientist, freely admitted the evidence supporting her belief came only from her mummy instincts. Just as we cannot blame Tom Cruise for offering his strongly held opinions about postpartum depression, we cannot fault Jenny McCarthy for trying to help parents as earnestly as she knew how. But that she was a celebrity did have an impact on the power of her opinions. In his book, The Panic Virus, Seth Mnookin reports that Jenny McCarthy's theories on autism single-handedly pushed vaccine skeptics into the mainstream. She appeared on TV for weeks, not on entertainment programs, but on news shows. She sat on panels alongside physicians from the American Academy of Pediatrics. Journalists discussed her ideas as seriously as they did reports on scientific studies in a statement disputing the vaccine theory issued by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The public not only listened to Jenny McCarthy, but even changed its opinions. The more Jenny McCarthy talked on TV about her distrust of the medical community, the more parents began adopting the same skepticism, eventually making decisions against their own pediatrician's advice. Following McCarthy's TV appearances, the number of parents declining vaccines for their children skyrocketed. One thing to enjoy watching celebrities when they entertain us, it's another entirely, and our fascination with these high-status figures begins to affect our own behavior. And popularity number 3, problem number 3, when we strive for status, is our desire for status out of whack? Is it excessive? Fame is in. Power, influence, prestige are hot. Character, kindness, and community, not so much. There is no Mandarin word for popularity that has the same meaning among adolescents in Western nations. In the United States, status and likability are very distinct attributes. It's only very modest overlap. In China, adolescents who have high status are those who are judged to be most likable. In the United States, high status was associated with those who are highly aggressive. In China, the opposite, highly aggressive teens were low in status. So in a culture that values community, status is not all that important. So even if you live in a close-knit, high-intensity community like Orthodox Judaism or Seventh-day Adventism, the status is not nearly as important. Our increased desire for status in the West reached a turning point in the 1980s when the media became a peer that never slept. So we finally got a TV in my home when I was 14 in 1980. And yeah, that did begin warping my values. I began thinking more and more about the stuff I saw on TV and wanting to, have sex with the type of women that I saw on TV. Society, accustomed to interacting with a single daily newspaper and a few dozen radio and TV programs, suddenly found itself presented with thousands of options to receive content 24 hours a day. As the media's power increased exponentially, it started to use every angle it could to make sure that its audience remained motivated to keep tuning in. So yeah, the more TV you watch, the more you get addicted to watching TV. And popularity problem number 4, we think status will make us happy. Today, we live in a Warholian world where we all bid for our brief moment of highly visible status. In the United States alone, over $11 billion a year is spent on plastic surgery. Books about how to earn excessive wealth and prestige regularly appear on bestseller lists. Even in our private lives, moments when we should be working or connecting with loved ones, we post, we tweet, the not-so-huddled hope that we will garner status. Mid-2010 saw the emergence of consulting firms whose sole purpose is to help individuals increase the number of their social media followers. Will all this time, energy, and expense dedicated to raising our status pay off? Will this high status make us happier? Will more having Twitter followers or YouTube viewers make us happier? Answer is no.
The third person who didn't even see anybody would probably say, "What person? I don't even know what you're talking about." So, that's the end of them. The next step would be goal clarification. So if you believe that someone has just teased you, then that first person might say, well, in this situation, I want to assert my dominance. I really want to make sure that people don't tease me and they know that I'm not the kind of person that should really be treated that way. So maybe that's their goal. But, someone else might say, oh, well, I'm actually scared. They teased me and I'm a little bit frightened, or I feel really embarrassed or depressed, so I'm going to go withdraw. I really want to get out of the situation. That might be a different goal. The second person who saw the exact same event as something that had to do with flirting might say, oh, wow, they seem pretty hot. I want to date them. So, that might be their goal in that situation. So these goals then lead to a variety of possible responses. And automatically in our brains, we kind of scan all the things we've done in that situation before, and we think about all the things that we might be able to do. So when thinking of all the possible responses, the first person might say, well, I could walk over and hit that person. I could scream out at them, oh yeah, kind of like, don't do that to me. Or I could throw something at them or something like that. While the second person who thinks, oh, I think I'm being flirted with and my goal here is to try and get a date out of this, they might walk by that person and give them a smile back. They might scream out to them, oh yeah. Or they might go hand them their number or say that they want to text them or something like that. So usually after we scan all of the possible things that we can do, we come up with our response. We decide, okay, person number one says, I'm going to go throw my book at them. Person number two might say, well, I've decided I should just smile at them. That's the best way to handle it. Interestingly, just because we've decided on what it is that we're going to do, that doesn't mean that's actually what we do. A lot of us have really good intentions to do a certain thing.
Okay, here's a very telling anecdote from this book. My wife and I recently attended a dinner party. It was a great event. The food was delicious, the wine was flowing, and our laughter became so loud that we woke up our host kids. None of us knew more than a few of the other guests before we arrived, but we were all close friends by the time dessert was served. It was around that time that a man sitting across the table from us remarked that he was disappointed that his wife had decided to stay home. Is she okay? We asked. Oh no, sorry, he explained. She's not homesick. She's at home live tweeting a TV show so she can get more followers on her Twitter. Wow. Another time I was at a restaurant with friends and observed nearby diners waiting to see how many likes they got on a photo of their dinner plate rather than talking to one another. Oi. Or I was standing in front of the Sydney Opera House in Australia. I overheard a group of friends debating which selfies would be best to post on their Facebook profiles rather than pictures of one another. Each case highlighted the difference between the two types of popularity, status versus likability. Made me wonder whether we had begun to lose sight of the one that really matters, which is likability. Each of these instances seemed that people were choosing to invest in visibility, prominence, and immediate social rewards rather than in more meaningful social connections. People were choosing to pursue status over likability.
When we actually go and do it, it comes out a little bit different than we expected. So the person that decided to throw their book might decide to also scream out at the same time, take that. Whereas the second person might decide to smile back and also say something like, hey, how's it going? Or something like that. So all these steps are happening really, really quickly. And what's interesting is that the reason why all these things occur are because of the experiences we've had before, and specifically the experiences we've had with popularity. What we've learned is that we can predict how people will encode things, how they will interpret things, and so on, what goals they'll make and what responses they consider, select, and enact, all based on how popular they were as younger kids. That creates a template, a way of us interacting with the world, and it affects us thousands of times a day. Sometimes we think about this very seriously and very specifically. So for instance, imagine you've gone on a first date. There may be some of these steps that you've debated about and ruminated about forever. What did they mean by that text? And does that mean they like me or they don't like me? And what should I do? Should I say that back? Should I put a little emoticon? Does that seem I'm trying too hard? All of these are ways that we think very specifically about these steps and even obsess over it sometimes. And that shows us that we really are engaging in these steps. But remember, most of the time it's happening automatically without us even realizing it. So here's an example. Before I asked you.
Okay, so back to this excellent book. Get the Kindle for $11 by Mitch Prinstein, psychology professor. Popular, Finding Happiness and Success in a World That Cares Too Much About the Wrong Kinds of Relationships. So you'll find thousands of books on Amazon on how to get rich, but not that many books about how to become likable. So high status kids in high school by their 20s, significantly more likely to abuse alcohol and marijuana, higher likelihood of having serious substance related problems like DUIs and drug related arrests. Here's their focus on high status as teens was significantly related to these poor adult outcomes. Having high status at age 13 predicts poorer quality friendships later in life. Higher status teens are less likely to be in satisfying romantic relationships as adults. When those relationships broke up, they were more likely to believe that it was because their partners did not find them to be popular enough or part of the right crowd. Caring about status at age 13 seemed to be related to a lifetime of seeking more popularity. So people who devote themselves to seeking extrinsic goals, goals outside of themselves, external recognition, it's in the results of that are an inverse relationship with life satisfaction, happiness, well-being. Those who seek intrinsic rewards, such as those that come from close and caring relationships, personal growth, helping others, report far greater happiness, vitality, self-esteem, and even physical health. Seeking extrinsic goals such as fame, power, excessive wealth, and beauty is associated with discontent, anxiety, and depression. The more strongly people yearned for status, the more likely they were to fare worse later in their lives. Now, our brain is wired for us to yearn for status. It's when this yearning gets out of control, when our instincts get out of whack, get into trouble. Over time, we've created new ways to help satisfy these cravings. Society has fostered the illusion that by spending enough time, money, and energy, anyone can attain high status. That is not the kind of popularity that will make us happy. So we are naturally tuned into status, but this instinct doesn't always help us. A tendency to follow that herd can have seriously negative consequences. Simply knowing that popular peers would be likely to drink alcohol, smoke pot, or have unprotected sex was sufficient to change adolescents' answers whether they would do so. That's why in my community, Orthodox Judaism, the parents spend $20,000, $30,000 a year to send their kids to Orthodox day schools to get away from this, to raise their kids in a bubble. Our participants were far more apt to say they would engage in all these behaviors than before they saw that the high status kids were doing them. Even when they had logged off and were told none of their peers were watching, our subjects continued to state that they would pursue these risky behaviors. Being unpopular, unliked, isolated, disconnected, lonely predicts mortality rates. People with larger networks of friends have a 50% chance of increased survival by the end of the study. One of the most common risk factors for suicide is feeling lonely, or a burden, feeling like a burden to others, or that one doesn't belong. Among adolescents in particular, ostracism from a peer group is an especially strong predictor of suicidal behavior. You'll notice that when people talk about feeling lonely, rejected, or unpopular, they tend to use words typically associated with physical illness. Terms like heartbreak, homesick, emotional scars, and hurt feelings are common in many languages. Some regions of our brains experience unpopularity in the same way that they respond to physical distress, a phenomenon called social pain. So certain regions of the brain are activated during a whole host of social rejection experiences. As soon as we even fear that we might get rejected from the group, our brain sends the most powerful signal at its disposal to warn us and motivate us back into the fold. So yeah, when I started having that feeling that I was going to be ejected from a group, that would inevitably become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It would change me once I start to have that feeling that my girlfriend was going to break up with me, or I was going to be ejected from this synagogue. Worrying about a breakup and ejection, seeing pictures of someone being teased, remembering a lost friend or loved one, even just thinking about being negatively judged by others, all seem to implicate the same brain regions. Low tolerance for physical pain. People with that are also more sensitive to interpersonal rejection and vice versa. Taking a Tylenol can actually reduce the sensation of social pain. Our brains try to ease the pain of headaches and heartaches in the exact same way. Unpopularity is also felt millions of other places in our bodies simultaneously and just as quickly within ourselves. Despite all our attempts through social media and YouTube to create ways to feel more connected than ever, we have never been more isolated and apart. Today we are more likely to live alone, to get married later, move our families farther away from our loved ones than ever before. In the past 20 years, the number of people reporting that they had no close confidant has tripled. And a good measure of that, do you have a close confidant, is do you know who you would call if you needed an emergency ride to the hospital? Who would you put down as an emergency contact when required to fill out those medical forms? There's one factor that has remarkable power to predict life trajectories, predicts which people will thrive and which employees will succeed, even predicts who will enjoy more rewarding romantic relationships and better physical health. It is likability. Likable people are not just perceived to be better at their jobs and to be more satisfied, happier, and more fulfilled. They actually are all these things. The reason that likable people live in a different world from the one inhabited by their unlikable peers. It is a world of their own making, and it produces a chain reaction of experiences that molds their lives in dramatic ways. The power of likability is not only evident among children. Acceptance can be identified at any age. Peer relationship dynamics are remarkably similar across lifespan, from 4-year-olds in preschool to senior citizens in retirement communities. Acceptance can be found in any context: the classroom, the office, the softball field, the places of worship, the PTA. All include people who seem effortlessly, immensely likable. So there are accepted, there are those who are consistently rejected, those who are consistently ignored, and then the controversial types. Compared to the rejected, accepted children grow up far less likely to drop out of school, to commit crimes, or experience mental illness as adults. So I think this probably comes from two facets of the Big Five personality test: people who are high in agreeableness and low in neuroticism. Children initially picked as most likable by their peers grow up to be the most likely to be employed and to get promotions and to sustain relationships. Likable people cooperate well with others. They're helpful, they share, and they follow the rules. Likable people are well adjusted. They are smart. They're usually in a good mood. They hold up their end of a conversation. They make sure to give others a turn to speak to. They are creative, especially at solving awkward social dilemmas. And most importantly, likable people do not disrupt the group.
I want you to watch a little video. The video had a box, and around the box there were 3 circles of different colors. It would have been perfectly appropriate to respond to that video that what you saw were 3 circles and a box. But most of us tend to anthropomorphize that video. We tend to see a story. But what story we see, the way that we interpret that stimulus, tells us a lot about ourselves. I have shown this video to many, many people over the years, and I want to give you a few examples of the ways that people will vary when they're asked to do the exact thing that I just asked you to do. Watch the video and just say what you saw. So for instance, some people will say, in a more neutral way, that they saw the red circle originally in the lead and the blue circle followed. Then red tags green, who followed and even gained the lead. Blue was very far behind and was left out of entering the square because the door closed before he got there. For instance, another person said, red and blue circles went around the big circle once, they stopped, they picked up the green circle. All 3 circles went around the main circle once. Finally, red and green entered and closed the door. These are pretty neutral responses. Look how this contrasts with folks that said something that indicated maybe a low level of aggression. What they said was, the blue circle forced its way into the box, bounced around for a few seconds around the red and green circles. Red and green ran out and closed the entrance on blue. Or, the blue circle tried to make others include him. He broke into the square and moved toward them. He threw himself against the sides of the square near where they're standing. The other circles didn't join them. They left the square. Here's another one. Blue forced its way into the room with green and red. Blue and green bumped shoulders until green was ready to leave with red because he didn't like hanging out with blue. Let me show you one more example. Here are people that saw the exact same video, but what they said suggested even more dramatic aggression. Here's what one person said. Okay, so red and green circle are chilling in the room. I think red is female. Blue is angry and feels left out, clearly blames green circle for excluding it. Breaks into the room. Looks like there's violence between green and blue circles. Another person said, blue banged on the door and forced it open. Blue was very mad, bouncing all over the place. Green faced up to blue. Blue and green fought. Green and red left the room and closed the door on blue. You can take a look at some of these. Here's one of my favorite. Blue busted down the box in a violent narcissistic rage and then provoked green into a fight. Green was not in the mood for fighting because he was happy and friends with red. Red chilled in the corner, scared of blue. Then green took red out of the box. As you can see, these different scenarios and the ways that people are describing them suggest that there are all kinds of attributions that we make just by seeing a simple video in which we all encoded the same information, 3 circles and a box. But the way that we interpret that is dramatically different. Some people thought that they saw circles of different genders. They assumed that one was a male, one was a female. Some of them assumed a lot of aggression. Some thought that they were just playing. All of that has a lot to do with what it was like for us growing up and how popular we were. So overall, hopefully this information is showing you that popularity, in fact, really still does matter. It's mattering in a way that's affecting every single social interaction that we have as adults, little by little. Our social experiences comprise a central database. We can change that database over time, but the database is overwhelmingly filled with experiences that happen when our brains became adult brains. And that was at the transition to adolescence. So the experiences we had as adolescents, which we mostly cared about popularity back then, they're the most important pieces of that database, which is why popularity plays a really big role at that point. That database tells us what we even see in the world around us, what we hear, how we interpret that, what goals we make, and what behaviors we think about, we select, and we decide to act on. We all have biases. Whether you're very, very popular or you are very unpopular, we all have different biases. The question is, what biases do you have? And are those biases things that are helping you in life, or are they hurting you and holding you back? Next, in the next video, I'll talk a little bit about some very common biases that we see, particularly among those who had trouble with popularity. And we'll talk about how those biases have affected people in adulthood.
Okay, that's Professor Mitch Prinstein. And love his 2017 book on popularity, likability, the difference between status and likability. 2017 book is titled Popular: Finding Happiness and Success in a World That Cares Too Much About the Wrong Kinds of Relationships. So, what constitutes a likable person? Those who cooperate with others, helpful, share, follow the rules, well-adjusted, usually in a good mood, hold up their end of a conversation, but make sure others have a chance to speak too. They're creative, especially solving awkward social dilemmas, and most importantly, they don't disrupt the group. So after accounting for all of these possible influences on adult outcomes, such as IQ, history of physical and mental illness, it's likability that best predicts happiness, employment, and income decades later. Likable children grow up to be less prone than others to be diagnosed with diabetes, obesity, high cholesterol, even high blood pressure. Back to Tucker Carlson.
Wars erupt, natural disasters descend, epidemics rage. None of it was in anybody's plan. There's something about human nature that prevents us from preparing for this, for abrupt and radical change. We pretend the unexpected will never happen. But there's something in nature itself that reminds us it inevitably will. It's always a terrifying realization. The rise of the Chinese coronavirus is that kind of moment. The virus is quickly becoming a global pandemic. Ultimately, it could kill millions. At the very least, it will reorder the global economy and change our politics. Could the disease help determine the outcome of our next presidential election 8 months from now? Of course it could. In fact, it will. Our leaders can't stop that. Like all matters of life and death, it is beyond human power to effect. But they can respond to the threat in a way that makes this country stronger, not weaker. How can they do that? Here's how. The first step is to take the virus seriously and to convince the public that you are. In 1918, Woodrow Wilson's White House downplayed the Spanish influenza and refused to take obvious precautions to slow its spread. Wilson had a pointless war in progress in Europe to fight. His generals couldn't be distracted from that goal. So the government continued to ship men to overcrowded army camps across the country and to pack them on ships to France. The virus spread exponentially. In the end, about 53,000 American soldiers were killed in combat in that war. At least 675,000 Americans died of the flu. Could Wilson have prevented that disaster? Well, not entirely. But by early and decisive action, he could have improved America's odds. So what does effective action look like now? Well, we ought to be screening people when they get off the planes from infected countries. That's not complicated. It's obvious. But at the same time, it is hardly a solution. We should be honest about how much we can do to keep the Chinese coronavirus from coming here. 100 years ago, the Spanish flu killed a significant percentage of the population in remote Aleutian Islands, and that was before air travel. Today, the entire world is connected by hourly international flights. Global pandemics are inevitable. There's too much movement to keep viruses isolated. We should acknowledge that. Yes, we can do our best to keep foreign diseases out of this country, but we ought to spend most of our time trying to figure out how to protect Americans once the diseases get here. There's still a lot we don't know about the Chinese coronavirus, but two things do seem clear. It is highly communicable, and the elderly and people with pre-existing respiratory disease face the greatest threat from it. That means for most Americans, the biggest risks will come not from the virus itself, but from its ancillary effects. People will panic, travel will be disrupted, markets will tumble, and, most critically, hospitals will be overwhelmed. We're about to learn the limits of our healthcare system. Conditions will be tough for the many thousands of Americans looking for beds to recover from the flu. In Seattle, they already are. But things will be even worse for anyone suffering from, say, pancreatitis or a burst appendix, not to mention countless other health emergencies. People like this may not get care at all. Our system won't be able to accommodate them. There are many implications of this, and some of them are political. For example, is this really the time to invite the rest of the world to join Medicare for all? Probably not. That idea was always stupid. Now it's clearly dangerous. On a practical level, saving American medicine from collapse must be our leaders' top priority right now. We need to expand emergency hospital bed capacity. We need to make certain we have enough life-saving drugs and medical equipment, the basics. Unfortunately, that's not as simple as it sounds or as it should be. Well, the rest of us who are arguing about sexism and transgendered bathrooms, China took control of our healthcare system. China dominates the world market in pharmaceutical ingredients, compounds used in virtually every essential medicine for high blood pressure, for cancer, for Alzheimer's disease, and many more come from China. So do key components in vital medical technology, CT scanners, X-ray machines, ultrasounds. As of tonight, more than 95% of all the antibiotics in America are manufactured in communist China. 95%. Our chief global rival has a total monopoly on the most important medicine in the world. That should worry you more than anything the candidates are currently talking about. Imagine watching one of your children die from an infected cut. China has the power to make that happen. The Chinese government is acutely aware of this power. Last year, a prominent Chinese economist suggested cutting off the supply of antibiotics to the United States as leverage in the trade war. That should have been the biggest story in America. The news media all but ignored it. Why? Because it implicated them and their political party in one of the greatest crimes of our time. 9 years ago, famously brilliant former President Barack Obama did predict a connection between China and the next global pandemic. Unfortunately, Obama got it backward. He claimed China would help us.
I absolutely believe that China's peaceful rise is good for the world, and it's good for America. To the extent that we have a partner in addressing issues like climate change or pandemic.
Our foremost genius. The people in charge have no idea what they're doing, and to the extent they do, they're selling us out on purpose. We should have seen this coming. In recent weeks, you've heard a lot about disruption to our so-called supply chains. Think about what that means. It means that thanks to economic changes that made a small group of business moguls incredibly rich, we no longer make the things we need to survive and prosper as a nation. People who hate us and who seek to displace us make those things. And it's not just medicines and X-ray machines. It's computers and phones and robotics and automotive components and machine tools and essential parts for aircraft engines, etc. In fact, apart from fossil fuels, it's almost everything. And now you may have noticed many of our leaders are talking about shutting down our domestic energy sector, the last independent part of the American economy. This is sabotage, and we're about to learn how undermined we've been. At some point, our leaders should be held to account for this. For now, we need to work as if our lives depended on it to fix this problem. Global warming isn't the existential threat we face. Extortion from China is. In very real ways, the Chinese government controls us. There is no greater national security danger than the one they pose. To respond, we need a modern Marshall Plan, one designed to rebuild essential American manufacturing. We should start tomorrow with medicine and technology to fight the coronavirus, and then with antibiotics. Some will oppose the idea because it poses a threat to arrangements they currently benefit from. But a majority of Americans will welcome it gladly, even in the Congress. Manufacturing lifts every congressional district. It shouldn't be hard to win bipartisan support. No doubt the sages on television will denounce any acknowledgement of China's threat as racism or intolerance. Joe Biden's already done that. Ignore them. The Chinese coronavirus really is Chinese. It arose in that country for the same reason American businesses have sent so many of our jobs there: lax health and safety standards and endemic corruption. China did this to the world, and we should not pretend otherwise. That's not xenophobia, it's true. The most bitter irony of all of that is that a few years from now, when every last victim of this virus has recovered or been buried, the Chinese government could easily grow stronger because of this disaster and America weaker. China unleashes a pandemic and then overtakes the U.S. as a result? That's too horrible an outcome to contemplate and too dangerous for us. We ought to do everything we can to make certain it does not happen. Well, let's start by accurately describing what is happening. The Chinese coronavirus isn't some fluke of globalization. It is the inevitable byproduct of it. Exotic diseases and the mass disruption they cause are the built-in cost of connectedness, and they always will be. The people who told us there was no downside to living in a borderless world were lying. Make them eat their words. Strip them of their power. Never listen to them again. In fact, and this is still the hardest thing for official Washington to accept, this pandemic vindicates Donald Trump's entire political thesis. On the big things, Trump was right. Trade, immigration, manufacturing, globalization. These are the issues our ruling class assiduously ignores and has ignored for decades in favor of silly, calculated distractions like gender warfare and race politics, things that divide us. Trump, by contrast, ran on the issues that mattered, and he won precisely because the public was tired of being lied to, and he should remember that. The White House reaction to coronavirus so far has been uneven and limp, but it doesn't need to be. The blueprint for an effective response that not only protects this country, but improves it, is right there in the president's 2016 acceptance speech at the Republican convention in Cleveland. Americanism, not globalism, will be the credo, he said. We're going to start building and making things again. All we need to do is start believing in ourselves and our country again. It is time to show the world that America is back, bigger and better and stronger than ever before. There it is. That's the governing agenda in the age of the Chinese coronavirus. Abandon globalism, rebuild the country, make the things we need. A strong America is an independent America. There's no other way. Ned Ryan is founder of American Majority and author of the book Restoring Our Republic. He joins us tonight. Ned, thanks so much for coming on. So coronavirus comes to our country, and we discover, some of us for the first time, that the tools, many of them, that we need to fight the virus are controlled by our chief rival, China, which wishes us harm. What lessons should we draw from that?
It shows yet again, the coronavirus shows us yet again, Tucker, how dangerously dependent we are on the barbaric Chinese communist regime. I mean, you mentioned that 95% of our antibiotics are coming from China. A Department of Commerce study showed it might even be a few points higher. And 80% of the products used to make drugs domestically come from China as well. But even more troubling, Tucker, most of the generic drugs that are used to keep our military healthy are also coming from China. And I think one of the things that Trump can do and be very decisive on this is bring the manufacturing of antibiotics and drugs home. He should give tax breaks, incentives, and he should also look at how he can responsibly lower the regulatory state and how we do drug manufacturing in this country. This is an opportunity. We have to take the moment and seize it. And I hope Trump does that on that front.
I mean, it's a pretty clear path forward. I mean, there will come a time when I do think it's important to hold the people who did this accountable, name their names, make them explain why they did what they did. I mean, they've really undermined our country in a way that's threatening to its existence, I think. But for now, there's really no path forward other than to become self-sufficient once again, don't you think?
That's exactly right. And I think what he should do is obviously remind people this dangerously naive approach that somehow we welcome China into the WTO, they'll become a liberal democracy, we'll all live happily ever after in some sort of nirvana, is a very dangerous idea. And I think what Trump needs to do is call out the corporatists that sold us out. But also at the same time, Tucker, one of the reasons that we offshored a lot of this production is the heavy administrative state regulations. And that's why it drove off our last penicillin production factory shut down in 2004, as the Chinese were investing a lot more money into the production of penicillin. We've been sold out by the corporatists, and we've been sold out by the administrative state and its regulations. Trump can address both of those very forcefully.
Yes, and I mean, I just reread today his speech in Cleveland, referenced in the Open, right. And he basically lays out the program in that to respond to coronavirus now, almost 4 years later. So he's already written the blueprint for this, and we're all hoping
stay true to it.
He uses it.
Yeah, no, stay true to it,
yeah, right.
and do not lose sight of it.
Amen. Thank you. Good to see you.
Thanks, Tucker.
Okay, so what's going on elsewhere in the news here? We got a little clip, a couple of clips
that actually, with the money he spent, he could have given every American $1 million.
I've got it. Let's put it up on the screen. When I read it tonight on social media, it kind of all became clear. Bloomberg spent $500 million on ads. U.S. population 327 million. Don't tell us if you're ahead of us on the math. He could have given each American $1 million and have had lunch money left over. It's an incredible way of putting it.
It's an incredible way of putting it. It's true. It's disturbing. It does suggest, what we're talking about here, which is there's too much money in politics. And it makes it difficult because what we want in
wants to think that Donald Trump's the smart one and y'all elitists are dumb.
You elitists with your geography and your maps and your spelling. Even though
your math and your reading.
Yeah, you're reading, your geography, knowing other countries, sipping your latte.
All those lines on the map.
Only them elitists know where Ukraine is.
Okay, I don't understand why Elizabeth Warren didn't do better with the working class.
How are you? I'm good. I'm having such a crazy day.
Hey, thank you. I love
Thank you so much. Well, I have to tell you, what I realized, it was when it was at the last debates, and I was like, this health insurance industry is a fucking racket. I've had enough. And then I was like, it's all about you. And then I was like, I'm just Team Warren. And then I was like, I just can't wait to stay. And then I accidentally had a tirade when I was talking to the acting president of Planned Parenthood on my podcast this last week. And then that's when I just accidentally blurted out that I was endorsing you. And then I was like, I was going with it. It's the time to just go with it.
It felt right.
It did. It really is.
Not just some of it.
So excited. I really want to get you on the podcast. I really want, once you have really fleshed out what we're doing for, healthcare for all and what we're going to do with the things, so I can tell my moderately Republican family what to expect on taxes and everything, so I can just assuage their fears. Let me know the numbers, honey. I'm ready to disseminate. I'm really good at getting rid of stigma, honey. So whatever we're going to do to destigmatize the idea of healthcare for all. Because you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of when people want to save money. They want to it's oh, let me just drive home from the bar because I don't want to get a cab, but then it is so much more expensive. That's when you get the DUI. That's what not having healthcare for all is like. It's they're it's too expensive, but this is too expensive because by not having it for anyone, we end up spending so much more money. If we would just take care of people up front, we could really get rid of so many of these problems. So I'm so excited to be shoulder to shoulder with you too. I can't believe you called. Let me know how I can be of service. I really want to help. So connect me with your people, and I'm so down to help. Senator Warren, go save America. We gotta go, and also too, we also really gotta get that Mitch out of there because regardless of Mitch McConnell, he's the worst. So we gotta take the Senate. We're gonna take Congress back. Well, we already have Congress. We gotta take the Senate back, and then we gotta get you in the.
Yeah, I just don't understand why Elizabeth Warren didn't do better with the working class. That's it from